I now suggest that our meeting commence in public session. I have received apologies from Senator Joe O'Reilly. I administered the usual precaution re-COVID. All those present in our committee room are asked to exercise an element of personal responsibility to protect yourself and indeed others from risk of COVID-19. Our agenda item this afternoon is our meeting with Lieutenant General Sean Clancy, Defence Forces Chief of Staff. Very pleased to welcome the Chief to discuss the work of the Defence Forces along with the priorities for our Defence Force, as well as welcoming Chief of Staff Clancy. Also very pleased to welcome Lieutenant or Brigadier General Russell Mulcahy, Assistant Chief of Staff, Colonel Cayman Keogh, Director, Strategic Planning Branch, Colonel Rory Sheeran, Human Resource Branch, and Commandant Gemma Fagan, Staff Officer, Chief of Staff Division. The format of our meeting is in the usual manner. We will hear an opening statement of the Chief of Staff, which will be followed by a question and answer session with members of the committee. I ask members to be concise in their questions to allow all members the opportunity to participate. Hopefully we'll have a second opportunity for members to come back in should they so desire before the end of our meeting. I advise members that the Chief of Staff is not responsible for areas of policy, and these are areas that will not be the subject matter of discussion. As we know, policy areas are in the remit of the Taoiseach, a Minister for Defence, who is a regular invitee, attendee at our committee. I very much welcome the Chief of Staff. It's the first opportunity we've had since your appointment, and we offer the congratulations of the committee and our members on your appointment of Chief of Staff. We look forward to your opening statement, and indeed in this regard we again offer our condolences and our sympathy to you in our memory of Private Sean Rooney, killed in action in active service in Lebanon in December of last year. We once again convey our sympathies to you, Chief of Staff, and also to Sean's colleagues. I remind witnesses and members of the long-standing parliamentary practice that we shouldn't criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make them in any way identifiable or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of that person or entity. Therefore, if any statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed to discontinue your remarks, and it's of course imperative that any such direction be complied with. Obviously, Chief, we have been we've been keeping a close eye on developments within the Defence Forces since the committee was inaugurated less than 3 years ago. We had the opportunity of a number of field trips post-COVID, in particular to Hull-Bolan, to Baldonnell, and to the Curragh. And we have also engaged with members of the Commission on the Defence Forces, and in particular Chairman Aidan O'Driscoll. We have examined the report and its recommendations, and we look forward to meeting the Implementation Committee in due course. So I now call on you, Lieutenant General Clancy, to make your opening statement. After which I'll open to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I plan to speak for about 20 minutes, if that's acceptable to the Chair. I'm conscious that I didn't provide a brief prior to my attendance here today. and therefore I think it's important that I set a complete context insofar as practicable to set the context for the conversation that we will hopefully have afterwards. So if that's acceptable to you, Mr. Chairman, I think it'll take about 20 minutes.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Gédol síos mar cheann fór an óglaigh na hÉireann bhfuilm mo bhuíochas go bhfuil ball an choiste as ócht an chorach chun leabhart libh ar chursaí a buineann le agus tá síochtaí óglaigh na hÉireann. Tá mana tú go mór le cadra deafach liom an libh agus le sibh a chur ar an ólas faoi an hábhar atá faoi mo thuairim. As Chief of Staff of Defence Forces, can I thank the committee for the invitation, for my attendance here today and the opportunity to address you on the matters and priorities relevant to the Defence Forces at this point in time. This afternoon I intend to brief you on the current and future focused developments concerning the Defence Forces, to include the security environment, my organisational priorities, cultural change, the Commission on the Defence Forces and retention and recruitment matters. In that context, I look forward to a positive engagement, and I hope to inform you on any issues you may raise within my remit and my responsibilities. I accompanied this afternoon, as already outlined by the Chairman, by Brigadier General Rossa Mulcahy, my Assistant Chief of Staff, to my left, Colonel Rory Sheeran to my right, the Defence Forces Director of Human Resources, Colonel Cayman Keogh, my Director of Strategic Planning Branch, and Commandant Gemma Fagan, who is a member of my Chief of Staff's division. The members of this committee will be very well aware that we are facing a number of unique and unprecedented opportunities and indeed challenges. I am personally invested in leading the Defence Forces to address the key issues that we face as an organisation in collaboration with our departmental colleagues, and since taking up my role as Chief of Staff in September 2021, I have reflected in how Óglaigh na hÉireann can improve and develop, thereby ensuring that we are operationally ready for deployment at home and overseas, and ever ready to carry out the roles and tasks as assigned by government. Nevertheless, despite our very real challenges, some of which I will address in some detail here, it is important to appreciate that this is also a period of great opportunity for the Defence Forces. The report submitted to Government by the Commission on the Defence Forces provides a generational opportunity for Ireland and for Óglaigh na hÉireann. Most importantly, the government-approved recommendation provides a roadmap to redesign and develop the future force out to 2028. The future structures and capabilities of the Defence Forces will be redesigned in order to respond to developments in both the national and international security environments. The threat and risk environment looking out to 2030 and beyond remains complex and unpredictable. Our overseas deployments remain a priority and are a visible demonstration of Ireland's commitment to international security and multilateralism. The mandated missions or operations where our members deploy are often challenging, and in some cases in hostile environments, where tragically some of our personnel have paid the ultimate sacrifice, as evidenced by the loss of 89 personnel throughout our 65 years of unbroken service with the United Nations. And like the Chairman, I too would like to take this opportunity to remember Private Sean Rooney, a soldier, a peacekeeper and a colleague who was killed on active service in the Lebanon on the 14th of December 2022 and who remains to this day and always in our prayers and in our thoughts, as do his family and his friends. Oireachtas go raibh anam dílis. The security environment assessments inform how we train and prepare our forces, so that we can secure our national sovereignty and defend and protect the citizens of Ireland. Reflecting on the number of global challenges that have emerged over the past number of years, it can be seen how these developments have informed the current employment of our forces. I am immensely proud of the key role that we have played in support of the Health Service Executive and other government departments and agencies during the COVID-19 pandemic. We demonstrated in a very real and tangible way the value and benefit that the Defence Forces brings when called upon in times of national crisis in terms of our planning competence, logistical and operational expertise, dual-use capabilities and, most importantly, our personnel. That experience has also informed the Defence Forces' response to other recent government taskings and requests for assistance to support, for example, beneficiaries of temporary provision and protection and those seeking permanent international protections. We have enabled the provision of emergency accommodation in a number of military installations, and we continue to deliver those supports to the lead agencies within our means and our capabilities. The Defence Forces planning and cyber defence capabilities were also deployed in support of the HSE when it was subject to a serious cybercrime incident in 2021, and we continue to support the National Cyber Security Centre with the secondment of personnel and expertise when required. The Defence Forces Army Ranger Wing, or Special Forces, were also tasked in 2021 to support, secure and assist a DFA-led Emergency Council Assistant Team operation in Kabul, Afghanistan. That mission facilitated the evacuation of 26 Irish citizens and dependents during that challenging period. All of these examples serve to heighten the public's awareness of the value that a competent and capable Defence Forces delivers in terms of national resilience for our people and this state. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which occurred after the publication of the report on the Commission of the Defence Forces, has worryingly signalled the return of high-intensity conventional and hybrid conflict to the European continent. As the government has reiterated, Russia's war is an assault not just on the Ukraine, but also on the international rules-based order. This new security paradigm emphasises the need for robust planning and preparation of contingent capabilities to meet current and future assigned tasks. This must be achieved while also continuing to contribute to international peace support operations and humanitarian missions. The government's decision to participate in the EU military assistance mission in support of Ukraine will enable the Defence Forces to consider deployment of up to 30 personnel to provide specialist training supports. This planning consideration is ongoing. These types of threats and emerging tasks underline the utility of and the requirement for a Defence Forces that is flexible, adaptable, capable and interoperable as part of a whole-of-government approach to security and defence. Following my appointment as Chief of Staff, I identified 3 key priority areas to guide staffing, efforts and the desired outputs. The priority areas are development and well-being, international communications and Commission on Defence Forces implementation. They focus on identifying and delivering projects and work strands that can be progressed by the Defence Forces, our policies and our procedures. My overall intent is to empower leaders at all levels to improve retention conditions, to implement and progress positive means of internal communication, and to support and enable the modernisation and development of the force. It is my intent to drive positive change from within in order to realise the total package of benefits associated with being a member of Óglaigh na hÉireann. Balancing our required operational outputs in tandem with developing our future force design, structures and staffing in line with the Commission on Defence Forces level of ambition is an ambitious but appropriate objective. Closely linked and central to the realisation of my overall intent, it is my determination and resolve to tackle any form of inappropriate behaviour such as bullying, misogyny and sexual harassment. Let me assure you that any form of unacceptable behaviour is completely contrary to our values and our ethos, and I am very much determined to tackle this problem in order to ensure the safety and well-being of all our personnel. Any incident of inappropriate behaviour is one incident too many, and it will not be tolerated. I am on the record as stating that the vast majority of those who serve Óglaigh na hÉireann are appalled by the lived experiences and accounts shared by our fellow colleagues, both serving and retired, particularly those that came to light following the Women of Honour documentary. And I am grateful for the opportunity to reaffirm that position here today and to state it before this committee. I await the publication of the Independent Review Group's report, and I have assured An Tánaiste and Minister for Defence of my intent to work with all stakeholders in order to fully implement the recommendation as approved by his office. I am confident that the IRG's recommendations, in addition to Defence Forces work streams already commenced in this area, will further enable our organisation to be grounded on best culture, ethos and values, which is no more than our members should expect and deserve. In addition, as you may be aware, one of the 5 strategic objectives central to the implementation of the Commission of the Defence Forces report is concerned exclusively with addressing workplace culture, HR practices and policies for our members. I firmly believe that these progressive initiatives, combined with the IRG's recommendations and the internal steps taken to date, will provide those who serve with a workplace that is fully aligned with the principles of dignity, equality and mutual respect. With that, I would now like to turn my remarks to the Commission on the Defence Forces report. As you're no doubt aware, the Commission reported in February 2022, and in July of last year, the Government approved a high-level action plan. The ambition is to now advance over a 6-year period to a level of Defence Forces capability equivalent to that required to enable level of ambition 2 as defined in that report. This will entail multi-annual funding increases, which have commenced in 2023, to reach a defence budget of some 1.5 billion in 2022 prices by 2028, and involves increases in personnel numbers of some 2,000, creating a new Defence Forces establishment of 11,500. The Commission identified the critical importance of the unbreakable link that must be established between government decisions on defence policy, level of ambition, capability and approved budget lines. In that vein, the Commission concluded that our current capability ambitions were inconsistent with the more ambitious statements outlined in defence policy, and that a continuation of that model would leave the defence instrument without a credible military capability to protect Ireland, its people and its resources for any sustained period. Their recommendation to move to an enhanced level of ambition 2 by 2028 has been approved by Government and is now a significant catalyst for change for the Defence Forces. It should be noted that all of 130 of the Commission's recommendations have been categorised into 5 strategic objectives. These core areas concern transformational change to modernise organisational culture and HR strategies and practices, the reform of high-level command and control, and the creation of new joint services, strategic and operational headquarters, supported by 3 service chiefs, the revitalisation of the Reserve Defence Forces, the reform and restructuring of the 3 services, and joint capability development. A joint civil-military implementation management office is currently engaged with external consultants to develop a detailed implementation plan to be approved by Government. That plan will timeline and chart how and when projects will be progressed to achieve its objectives. During this time, the Defence Forces and the Department of Defence have not stood still, and I have progressed a number of initiatives in collaboration with the Secretary-General and her staffs in line with the high-level action plan recommendations. Since the beginning of the year, I have designated an Office of Reserve Affairs led by a Colonel rank. That office will be tasked with designing a new plan to regenerate our reserve forces for the approval of Oireachtas and Minister for Defence. The Reserve Defence Forces are an integral part and valued part of capability under our single force concept, and we welcomed the Defence Amendment Act 2021, which provides for RDF supplemental military service in support of the permanent Defence Forces, and the emergency measures in the Public Interest Act of 2020. These legislative changes and amendment enables the Reserve to contribute significantly to the wider Defence Forces efforts during the COVID pandemic, while also having the effect of removing the absolute prohibitions within the Defence Act on members of the Reserve serving overseas. I am also progressing the designation of a gender advisor to my office, and pending that appointment, in the interim, I have institutionalised the attendance of a senior female officer to provide a broader perspective at weekly and monthly General Staff meetings and to advise the General Staff on gender-specific issues. Women comprise of over 7% of our workforce currently, and that is a capability gap. That number needs to grow, and we are working on this as part of our recently launched Be More recruitment campaign, as well as other initiatives. Work is also well advanced on the high-level action plan as published. This plan identified a total of 38 key early actions to progress a number of recommendations arising from the Commission's report. These early actions will also act as the necessary building blocks to support the full detailed implementation plan. An update report is due to be published by Oireachtas and Minister of Defence in the near future, prior to the delivery of the detailed implementation plan. I'm happy to report that significant progress has been achieved in many areas, including pay and allowances, the development of a new vision statement for the Defence Forces, on ways to expand our recruitment and induction capacity to include the development of a new joint recruitment and induction training centre at Gormanstown Camp, on the creation of civil military capability development branch to deliver new infrastructure, equipment and facilities needed to accommodate, train and operate our forces on land, air and sea, and competitions for the appointment of a new Head of Strategic Transformation and a new Head of Strategic HR, who will report directly to me, are actively underway. The progress to date has been briefed to the high-level steering board, which has been established to oversee implementation and is chaired by the Secretary-General of the Department of An Taoiseach. In addition, the Implementation Oversight Group, led by the independent chair, Ms Julie Cinnamon, has been established to oversee and drive progress in relation to the implementation of the recommendations of the Commission. This journey of modernisation and forced transformation will inevitably involve a level of disruption and will require significant organisational and cultural change. Ultimately, upon implementation, the ambition is to deliver a regenerated and fit-for-purpose force with an ambitious vision, a larger and more capable workforce, and a greatly enhanced multi-annual budget and resource envelope. One of my priority considerations over the last number of years concerns the recruitment and retention of personnel, our most valued resource. Our capability to deliver the required military outputs in a dynamic threat environment and in times of crisis rests on the sustained availability of sufficient personnel who are prepared physically, intellectually and psychologically. The members of this committee would be very cognizant of the human resource difficulties the Defence Forces have experienced in recent times. The full employment market conditions currently enjoyed by Ireland is the contested space that all employers must overcome when attracting recruits and retaining personnel in service. We are constructively engaged with our departmental colleagues in this space in order to ensure that we have a competitive edge. In addition, I am convinced that the future force in its structures and its staffing will have to be agile and adaptable in order to address the security challenges of the future. Recruitment into the Defence Forces occurs across a number of streams of enlisted and commissioned ranks. Though levels of induction have been generally robust, it has been challenging over the past number of years to grow sufficient numbers to keep pace with higher levels of exits. Defence Forces recruitment systems are regularly reviewed and updated. The implementation of relevant recommendations arising from the consultant-led review on recruitment continues. In addition, and in line with the Commission of Defence Forces recommendations, a new recruitment strategy has been developed with a focus on 4 principal themes: expanding induction pools, enhancing market effectiveness, optimising selection and induction methodologies, and maximising retention and training. However, we have also long understood that our turnover rate, recorded as 10.72% in 2022, cannot be addressed by recruitment strategies alone. I fully appreciate that a healthy balance between retention and exit numbers must be maintained if the Defence Forces is to remain fit for purpose. We have witnessed heightened levels of exits since circa 2016, and while the dynamic has softened during the pandemic years, 2022 figures confirm the resumption of an upward trend of voluntary exits. It remains to be seen if this is an after effect of career decision-making delayed during the pandemic or whether it points to a more permanent acceleration. Many aspects of military service have the potential to influence retention rates, including career opportunities, remuneration, intensity of training and operational missions, work-life balance considerations, infrastructure and equipment developments. The appropriate implementation of the Working Time Directive can play a key role in this and is positively welcomed by the General Staff. A European Court of Justice ruling from 2021, known as the Slovenian case, has been very significant to our understanding of this subject, and engagements are ongoing to arrive at draft heads of bill for the appropriate amendment for the Organisation of Working Time Act. In addition, work on a Defence Forces cross-functional retention strategy is under development and is relatively mature. The draft strategy focuses on a number of key retention themes, including culture, opportunities, supports, work-life balance, including the Working Time Directive, conditions of service and rewards and recognition. I am also cognizant of the double jeopardy that a reducing workforce entails, namely asking personnel to execute the duties and responsibilities expected of a fully established organisation. I acknowledge that it will take time for the Defence Forces to rebuild our strength levels. In the interim, we continue to review the scope of our domestic framework operations and our overseas commitments. Our intent is to reduce the totality of our current commitments in the short term, in order to enable and progress the regeneration of our force and the associated capability developments. Following the provision of military advice, the Government have signalled the intent to withdraw from the UNDOF mission on the Golan Heights, and this will facilitate other planned commitments. As a package, all of these initiatives should have a positive effect and when considered in addition to the ambition and realisation of the Commission of Defence Forces implementation plan, this will provide assurance to our personnel concerning their career opportunities, their work-life balance, their continued professional and personal development pathways, and the future direction of their respective services. Before I conclude, it is important for me to state and acknowledge the extremely positive and collaborative relationship that I enjoy with the Secretary-General of the Department of Defence, her staffs, and the full and unrelenting support and leadership of An Taoiseach and Minister of Defence. I can report that we are collectively on the same page and positioned to grasp this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to implement the changes that are necessary to build a regenerated and modernised Defence Forces. Finally, I would like to make mention of the role played by the Defence Forces in support of the Decade of Centenaries programme since 2012. I'm extremely proud of our contribution in this area, which also offered us an opportunity to increase the public's awareness and understanding of our role in the defence and security of the state, while also reinforcing our identity and our heritage. Our personnel have carried out many state ceremonial activities, most notably the 2016 Easter Parade, and more recently when making the centenary handover of Dublin Castle, adding a sense of pride, solemnity and dignity to these great moments of state. Our contribution to the decade has also reached into the cultural and societal spaces by the contribution and coordination and execution of the Flags for Schools programme, for instance, in 2016, and in various other collaborations and exhibitions with academic partners and our national cultural institutions. Such efforts, including our recent commemoration of the handover of the barracks to the contested Civil War commemorations, have clearly demonstrated that Óglaigh na hÉireann is a mature, reflective organisation, capable of respecting in an inclusive manner the totality of our shared history. I am immensely proud of our organisation and the people that serve in it, both past and present, and I am confident we will stand firm for 100 years more. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to address the committee, and as I pointed out at the beginning, I'm happy to take any questions that I can that are within my scope and my responsibility.
Okay, thank you, Chief. I'm now going to open matters to the floor. I'm conscious of the fact that we've quite a number of members offering, and I'm very pleased to welcome Senator Tom Sonnen, who, while not a member of this committee, is very welcome, especially having regard to your own expertise and experience, and would be happy to call you in due course should you have an issue to raise with the Chief of Staff. Will I commence with Deputy Brady or Deputy Clark?
I'll go first, John, if wants to. I don't mind. Thank you so much for your time coming in here today. It is much appreciated. And also I want to place on the record our thanks as a committee to your staff who have been so grateful in hosting us on our excursions over the last number of years. It's been incredibly informative and educational for us as a committee, and I'm sure that a huge amount of preparation goes into the visit of a committee coming down. And I'm quite sure at times it would have been best if we weren't there, because we can be a little bit awkward. There is quite a few of us who like to go on these. I want to start with a couple of very, very general questions around the Commission and the future of Defence, please. The establishment figure that was listed there, 11,500, do you think that's sufficient? Firstly. I'll do a few if you want to, or Chair, do you want to take a few contributors and then come back? How do you want to?
I think what we'll do is, if we take a number of observations and questions from deputies and senators, and then come back to the Chief of group, and also feel free to call in your colleagues where you deem to be appropriate. So I'll take Deputy Clark, followed by Deputy Lawless, and Deputy Brady, followed by Deputy Perry.
And also, in terms of the Reserve Defence Forces, an area that you will not find any disagreement with the future potential of the reserves. The targets for the reserve members, and in terms of their geographical spread and also the numbers across it, what in your mind would be sufficient to meet the needs that you have and the position that you also have? Now, the previous Chief of Staff had highlighted climate change as being an area of real concern and an area of future shall we say, work of the Defence Forces. Do you agree with that, or do you see another avenue that's there? And then for this round, Chair, my last question is, you mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic and the HSE and the role that the Defence Forces played in that, a very, very important role, a very tangible role, and one that was very much respected and appreciated. Now, it's my understanding that the reserve members of the Defence Forces received medals for their participation in Operation Fortitude. Would you envisage a medal being presented to the members of the Permanent Defence Forces? Would you be in support of that?
Thank you. I'll go to the Deputy Office.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief and your colleagues, you're very welcome to the committee today, and great privilege to have you with us here today. As my colleague Deputy Clerk said, I want to thank you on my own behalf and on behalf of colleagues for hosting our visits to the Curragh, Hoboken and a number of other sites that the committee visited over the last couple of years. As a Kildare representative, I'm particularly pleased with the operation you continue to run in Kildare and the Curragh and elsewhere, and indeed across the border in Baldonnell, and long may that continue. A couple of questions for you briefly. I suppose looking to the future, you mentioned in your opening statement the Commission on the Future of the Defence Forces and how this is an exciting time, and I entirely agree it is an exciting time and it's a great opportunity, I think, for the Defence Forces as well, I suppose, to ramp up and to take that support that's being offered by government in terms of, as you put it, a regenerated and modern Defence Force. I have particular interest in, I suppose, more modern forms of warfare, or more modern forms of attack or defence, what's often called hybrid. So we know about conventional warfare, but everything from, and we've heard of this committee evidence about subsea cables and interception, or certainly observance of those, surveillance of those off the Atlantic coast. Drone warfare is in the news at the moment, but drones, and whether they're being used by hobbyists or hostile nations or entities, they're an issue that are out there. Telecoms in general, outside of the subsea cables, telecoms and data centres and data farms, and our connectivity, which is at the heart of our sovereignty, I think, in terms of how we manage ourselves as a state and how we resource ourselves as a state. There's an economic imperative that we maintain our connectivity to the wider world, and indeed safeguard the data that we manage on behalf of so many others, not least commercially at the moment. Cyber defences, the whole information disinformation piece. So there's quite a bit there, and that's just a kind of quick snapshot. But in terms of the modernisation of the Defence Force that you envisage and that I share your excitement towards, I suppose the question is, what does a new, modern, regenerated Defence Force look like? And in particular with regard to the hybrid threats and ramping up to meet those challenges in the future. And my second question is related, I suppose, really goes to, we talked about numbers. Sometimes numbers can be oversimplistic in terms of what the headcount should be, but where do you see the force target being, and perhaps what would be the distribution be across the different arms of the Defence Forces, land, air and sea, I suppose one could say, but also across the new hybrid cyber type threats that I've mentioned. And lastly, my late granduncle served in the Defence Forces and served in the Congo and elsewhere on some of the early UN missions, and there's a great proud history there of the Defence Forces, and it's shared by members of my own family. So thank you for all that you do and that your colleagues do.
Thank you. Deputy Brady. What about Deputy Berry?
Thanks, Chair.
Back to the Chief.
First of all, I'd like to welcome the Chief before the committee here this afternoon, and your colleagues also. And before I start, I just want to express my condolences to you and all members of the Defence Forces in relation to the death of Sean Rooney. It was a tragic incident, and our gratitude to him and condolences to all members of the Defence Forces, and again to his friends and family. And just before I ask a series of questions, General, I just want to ask a specific question, because my engagement with the representative organisations, whether it be PD4, RACO, the Reserve Defence Forces Association, and given the fact that we have an ongoing inability to put ships to sea, the ongoing investigation into the sexual abuse allegations, the fact that the Reserve Defence Forces are, as has been put to me, on the brink of collapse, and the ongoing recruitment and retention issues in the broader Defence Forces. Where do you see morale within the Defence Forces? because certainly any engagement I have, morale seems to be at an all-time low. So where do you see morale at this stage within the Defence Forces? And central to fixing many of the issues around retention and recruitment, and you allude to it yourself, Chief, in terms of your opening statement, is, as I see it, the Working Time Directive, and that would be echoed by the representative bodies as well. And we know in the high-level action plan that was, published last year, and the actions that were deemed to be the low-hanging fruit. One of those was the heads of bill for the Working Time Directive were supposed to be brought forward within 6 months. We've now passed that. But in your contribution here, you talk about the appropriate implementation of the Working Time Directive. So can I ask, what is the appropriate implementation? Because when we ask the Minister, he talks about exemptions as opposed to the full implementation. So what do you see as the appropriate implementation? Because there's major concern there that what is actually going to be delivered is on paper meaningless because it will be riddled with so many exemptions. So what does appropriate implementation look like? Just in relation to the Reserve Defence Forces, I welcome the Office of Reserve Affairs. So I just want to ask you, given the ongoing crisis within the reserves, and again asked the Minister countless times as to immediate actions that need to be taken around recruitment. There seems to be a major crisis there, as has been referenced by the representative body, so much so that the last recruitment round in March last year, 1,000 citizens expressed an interest. 1,000 applications came in online, so much so that the online portal had to be shut down because they didn't have the resources to manage it. But out of that, only about 90 personnel were eventually recruited into the reserves, and a litany of failures from medicals to failure to contact people in time led to that. So is that an immediate action that is going to be taken to address that? Because clearly there are people there that want to be proud members of the Reserve Defence Force. So what is an immediate action that body, the Reserve Affairs Office, is going to take around that? The whole issue of Cathal Barracks, can I ask your view in relation to the future of Cathal Barracks? We know there is a review, there's consultants being appointed or in the process of being appointed, and we know the strategic importance of having an operational military barracks in the capital, close to government buildings and other critical infrastructure. So what's your view in relation to the future of Cathal Barracks from a defence and a military perspective? The critical importance of having an operational barracks like that in a city centre location. Just in relation to the Navy and the ongoing crisis there, the fact that we have two ships, the LE Roshan and the LE Neve, tied up, the inability to, carry out sea days because of the massive crisis there within the Navy. And we know the strategic and defence importance, the security importance of having ships at sea, whether it's the interception of drugs, acting as deterrent, policing our fisheries, but also the undersea cables. And given this horrific time that we're living in, the major threat of hybrid warfare, cyber warfare, and we know the previous military exercise being carried out by the Russians. Many would see Ireland now as the Achilles heel in terms of security for Europe, and particularly for those critical transatlantic data cable. So would you see us as an Achilles heel, given the fact that we can't put ships to sea? And do you see that, or what is your view in terms of, there's many nations now saying that we are the Achilles heel, and I believe that it is actually putting our neutrality at a military neutrality in jeopardy, because you know, other countries are actively talking about, you know, coming in, as they have done previously, to police our waters. So do you see it as a risk, an ongoing risk to our military neutral status? Just in relation to the figure of 11,500 in level of ambition 2, just to get your views in relation to that. But also there seems to be a creeping narrative around the civilianisation of our defence forces, and it is now being talked about that 11,500 will also include civilians, civilian contractors working for the Defence Force. And we know the Minister has already spoken about outside medics coming in to carry out medical assessments for recruitment, as opposed to dealing with the chronic shortage of trained military personnel to carry that out, military doctors, etc. So just to ask your views in terms of what I see as a growing civilianisation of military roles that would have been carried out proudly over many years. Now, I believe there is a minor role for civilian contractors to carry out different aspects. But you know, the failure to address the recruitment and retention issue is, you know, and retain personnel. I think, you know, bringing in civilians is a short-sighted measure. Just, Chief, can I ask your views in relation to, obviously we're in the midst of a housing crisis right across the state, and many people would be critical in the fact that in the Curragh, for example, I mean, there's many houses boarded up in the Curragh that would have been formerly used by members of the Defence Force. Can I ask you your views as to what you think should happen to the boarded up houses in the Curragh, for example? What role do you think should be utilised for those houses? Just the last point, sorry, Chair, just in relation to last point, the decision to withdraw from UNDOF, I think in my mind it was the wrong decision. I want to ask you your views as to what led to that. I think it's fairly obvious. The recruitment and retention crisis was the main instigator for that decision. Ask you your views in relation to why you believe that decision was taken by the Taoiseach and the Minister. Was it a direct consequence of signing up for an EU battle group, which is a 2-year commitment, which is going to tie up a large number of our defence forces, and given, as you proudly outlined there, our ongoing unbroken record in peacekeeping missions, and we know it's not this is a political decision. You know, our involvement in the UN missions and the soft power that we amass from our participation in peacekeeping missions such as that. In my mind, I believe further entrenchment in battle groups such as the EU battle group, again, is jeopardising our military neutrality. So, you know, to jeopardise our military neutrality by withdrawing from peacekeeping missions to sign up to battle groups is, in my mind, the wrong decision. So can I ask you your views as to why that particular mission, UNDOF, was ended? Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Brady. I'm conscious of the fact that we've got a lot of questions over a wide range of issues. So perhaps before I come to Deputy Berry, I might, in fairness, go back to the Chief to deal with some of the issues. I'm also conscious of the fact that some of the questions have moved over towards issues that might be regarded as policy. However, I know the Chief would be very keen to answer as comprehensively as possible, and I would ask him to do so in response to Deputy Clark, to Deputy Lawless, to Deputy Brady, and after the Chief has dealt with the questions as posed, I intend coming back to Deputy Berry, to Deputy Stanton, and to Senator Crockwell, who hasn't offered yet, but I know he's not going to allow the opportunity pass. Chief, you have the floor. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, and thank you all firstly for your kind remarks. And let me say that you're always welcome to any installation in the state that belongs to the Department of Defence and the Defence Forces. We're more than welcoming. It's important that, as we say, that we get ourselves outside the walls, and one way of doing that is for committees such as yourselves to come in and engage openly with us as an organisation, because the understanding grows through that, which I think is very important. And it's important that, as I said in some of my opening remarks, that the state as a whole and the people of the state understand what it is the Defence Forces do and how they do it, and the shortcomings and the challenges that we face, as well as the opportunities. So thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, there's a number of probably overlapping themes there, in particular between Deputy Clark and Deputy Brady, that I might try and address together. So if that's okay with you, and Deputy Lawless, I'll come back to yours as well as best I can. If I can just speak to maybe the 11,500 in terms of the context of the number, in terms of civilisation piece that you raised, and so on, which is important. I think the most overriding principle about, if I can say you asked my view, is that the organisation has to have a capacity to absorb and a capacity to grow. And 11,500, in my view, is correct and is sufficient. It's set down very clearly in Level of Ambition 2. Level of Ambition 2 has been set and accepted by government. So therefore, in my view, that is the right figure to grow towards. We have a challenge in this space with regards to our recruitment and our retention of people, and that is an ambitious challenge to meet 11,500, but we're determined to grow towards that. And I think in the timeline under a level of ambition, notwithstanding the fact that level of ambition 3 has to go back to thereafter also, which will see further growth of the organisation potentially at that time. Civililisation is not a new concept to militaries. Parts of militaries throughout first world countries in particular would have civilians participating within their forces, in particularly in specialist roles, analyst roles, technical roles, and so on. I think that is accepted. The number of 2,000 as outlined in the Commission of Defence Forces to grow to 11,500 is inclusive of civilian personnel, as laid down in the Commission report. So therefore that's very clear also. But civilisation is not a new concept to the Defence Forces either. We have many areas in which we have civilians, as you rightly pointed out, Deputy, in a contractual role, but also in a permanent role. I can point to Sea Fisheries Monitoring Centre, for instance, which we have grown in the last 24 months in particular, with the growth of the change in the European borders, where we've had a capacity that we needed to grow and respond to. And we've done that through a combination of civil and military personnel and analysts. We've done it in several other areas of the organisation that has been ongoing for many years. It just hasn't been, I suppose, as overt through the Commission as it has been through the Commission report as a whole. So I'm very satisfied that appropriate civilianisation in appropriate roles is a roadmap which we should not be afraid to undertake as an organisation that will be fit for purpose as we go forward. And I think that's the right approach to take once we've identified and analysed it. And that will come as part of our restructuring in the overall. As you may be aware, the Commission of Defence Forces gave us some handrails, if you like, on the distribution of the 2,000, and that goes to another part of your question. It gave us very kind of good, I suppose, broad brush boundaries under which they understood, and their recommendations with regards to the 3 services and how the application of the additionality would come about. That wasn't restrictive, it wasn't constrictive, but it was a guide. And we will use that certainly as part of the redesign and restructuring of the Defence Forces going forward, and we'll take that into account, although, as I said, we're not constricted by it, I would suggest, and thereafter. That answers, if that is satisfactory for that question. The reserve question, I think there was a couple also. There was one from both yourself, Deputy Clark, and from yourself, Deputy Brady, and it was quite extensive around the reserve. Firstly, I'm hugely proud of the Reserve Defence Forces, and I do think it has a huge role to play in the future. We operate the Reserve in a single force concept. There has been challenges around that in terms of regeneration. That is the purpose of the Office of Reserve Affairs. The Director of Reserve was taken away in the last re-establishment of the organisation, Defence Forces, back in 2012, if I recall correctly, and I'm open to correction on that. That lacked a focal point thereafter for the Reserve. From there, we have, through the Commission of Defence Forces, a very clear means in which we want to expand the Reserve Defence Forces and therefore expand our capability as a whole. The establishment as it's laid down at the moment, just getting, is 4,069, and we're under a strength at the moment of 1,600 approximately. That is way below where we want to be. You identified challenges that we had encountered, in particular in the last 24 months. I suppose, in one sense, COVID didn't help us in that space. But our medical capacity was one area that there was a blockage, if you like, in terms of what you refer to as our recruitment capacity over that time. Notwithstanding, we had an exponential need to recruit into the permanent defence forces at the same time, driven by our high rate of turnover. So all of these together didn't serve the Reserve. But most important, and the single most clear focal point that we were lacking, was somebody to drive and generate the Reserve in the institution itself. I've corrected that as recommended through the Commission of the Defence Forces. I believe that the regeneration, as it's laid down as a recommendation within that, is now underway, and there's clear means by which we intend to try and regenerate the Reserve Defence Forces. For example, one of the contracts that you referred to, the civilinisation of a particular area, was the induction medicals for both reserves and new recruitment into the Defence Forces. That contract will enable up to 1,800 recruitment medicals to be done on an annualised basis. I'm confident that with a successful outcome from that tender process, which is underway, will enable an enhanced recruitment process for our reserve and permanent defence forces equally. And that goes back to the very heart of the single force concept which I spoke about, whereby we need our reserve defence forces to be at the same level, as far as practicable, as our permanent defence forces. And the legislative acts enabled through this House that I refer to in my opening remarks, of course, foresees the Reserve Defence Forces participating fully in that manner. And they were enabled to do that through COVID. And of course, we know that the overseas deployment is an area where now that is opened up to the Reserve as well. And we have a standard, and we'd expect all of those forces that would have an ambition and to go overseas would meet a standard, and they would meet the same standard. And it's on that unity of effort of the totality of the organisation that we depend and we rely on for our expertise and our professionalism in our overseas deployments in particular. The medal for the HSC role for the Reserve, I'm not...
Sorry, I misspoke.
Okay.
I apologise for any confusion.
Yeah, no, the Defence Forces have not issued a medal, and we don't intend to issue a medal in this regard to any of our forces for their role during the HSC. The hybrid, I think, was captured by both Deputy Brady and Deputy Lawless on both areas. If I can refer, I suppose, to the Commission of Defence Forces as a starting point. The Commission of Defence Forces was very clear in terms of the capability gaps that exist between defence policy that's laid down in the White Paper of 2015, the commensurate tasks applied and direct tasks that fell out of that, and the capacity of the Defence Forces within means and capabilities provided by the state, that there was an imbalance between both. And that was very clearly identified within the Commission. As a consequence, capability gaps have opened up over time, and we're well aware of those, and the Commission outlined the areas in which we need to concentrate. The prioritisation that came out of the Commission report lends itself to that also. Two very clear areas were those that you spoke to around cyber and around hybrid. And we're actively pursuing in both those areas the recommendations of the Commission. But as you can appreciate, as I spoke, capacity and absorption are key areas that we need to be able to achieve, and it will form part of the actual development and redesign and restructuring of our forces as we go forward. But as you rightly pointed out, areas of critical infrastructure, such as cables and other infrastructure of that nature, they're important to the state. but the state has very much a whole-of-government approach. For instance, the cables that you spoke about falls directly under the responsibility of the Department of Communications, Climate and the Environment, and so on. So the Defence Force is part of the enabling, if you like, of supporting of the state in the wider whole-of-government approach, and that is the position we take. But from a capability point of view, we have a capability development branch which is in development. We have our equipment development plan which will feed into that, and that is a 5-year plan, now taking into consideration the overall expenditure growth that we expect under capital and infrastructural development that supports that. It's under an IDP. All of these are published on both our sites and I believe on the Oireachtas sites also, freely available. They're renewed on a rollover basis on an annual basis, and you can step through those to see exactly where the priorities are and where they're changing over time. The Commission laid very clear out on terms of the Army, the Air Force and the Naval Service in terms of what the priorities should be at this point in time, some of which lend itself directly into the cyber and hybrid space. The Commission also identified the need for cyber command structures, hybrid command structures, and we're very conscious, and in the redesign and restructuring of the organisation. And when we speak about fit-for-purpose defence forces, this is the areas that we need to grow, and that's where an agile organisation that is fit for purpose, that has a proper command and control structure, will enable, I suppose, the agility within the organisation to reshape itself, to rechange itself, reconstitute itself in response to the changing, unpredictable, dynamic security environment that we face today. If I can speak briefly to you mentioned the representative associations and indeed your conversations, and you had a number of questions around the Working Time Directive, and I think the reserve, which I've answered, and Cathal Brugha Barracks and the Naval Service in particular. I'll try and address those now. You're quite right. We have. I mean, it's well known that the challenges in terms of personnel and human resources within the Naval Service. That requires us to adjust our posture, if you like, with certain number of vessels. We have decommissioned 3 vessels by the nature of the fact that they're no longer efficient, that they're old, and part of the Commission's response is to build a new balanced fleet throughout the Naval Service in support of the Defence Forces operations and outputs. Part of that balanced fleet approach is to, as you know, we have acquired 2 inshore patrol vessels. We will then move on towards the wider, more, I suppose, longer term approach to a multi-role vessel. That will bring the Naval Service back up to its 9-ship fleet. So if you're to look at the Naval Service in terms of its outputs, it takes 2 things effectively, if I can be just as straightforward as that. It takes the platforms, and it takes the human resources to operate the platforms. And while we may have ships tied up, or we may have decommissioned ships, it doesn't prevent us in order of knowing what the capability requirements are and how to fulfil what's laid down within that on the Commission, and to have a medium to longer term view on that. And that will support the redevelopment, regeneration and the building of the Naval Service, because I must be optimistic, I am optimistic that we can turn the Naval Service human resources around. And we're moving in many streams to try and affect that. The human resource is the second part of that, to obviously man and operate those things. But to say, you know, we don't downsize the platforms, because that's counterintuitive to trying to growing the human resource, which is identified resource at a specific level that's required to fulfil the roles and the assigned outputs required and capabilities required by government for us. The Commission is under level of ambition 2, has spoken directly to a 9-ship operation to achieve that. And we intend to achieve that, and we're setting on course for a balanced fleet of 9 ships in due course by the time we move to 2028 and beyond. And generating the human resource to fulfil that is part of that ambition. The Working Time Directive, as you rightly pointed out, Deputy, arises from the up to 2016, the Defence Forces and the Garda Síochána were exempt from the Organisation Working Time Act. This change of policy at that time required a number of working groups to see the impact and effect. if I can, I suppose, say from the very outset, when with regard to the majority of actual routines, operations and daily outputs of the Defence Forces fall within the scopes of Working Time Directive and fall within the Working Time Directive itself at this point. What we're going through at the moment is a process of trying to develop a heads of bill to transpose the impact of that into legislation, which will come before this House in due course. We're engaged with the stakeholders, primarily, as you mentioned, the RAs is one part of it. And the European Court of Justice ruling at that time was very instructive, if you like, in terms of informing what was within scope. Within scope, and it identified several areas that were a national prerogative in terms of their own paradigm, their own security and defence, and to define what was within scope. We're in the process of an iterative process and consultative process with the RAs at this point in time. There's another meeting to happen later this week. The Taoiseach has been very clear that he wants a determination and a completion of this by the end of this year. We're all engaged in that at both the civil, military and representative association and other stakeholders, because it has a wide impact on it. But I'm confident that this will be completed and stood up by the end of this year. There is a number of areas that, of course, that are impacted by it. But as I said at the outset, the majority of activities of the Defence Force today fall within the Working Time Directive as it stands. We're now into the consultative process of defining what isn't within scope as a consequence of the European Court of Justice ruling, as well as the actual directive itself, in order that we can transpose it accurately. And of course, this doesn't fall within the Defence Forces gift. This is a policy issue ultimately, and also the AGs and others have to be involved in this, and it falls to DETI, in fact, to transpose it into legislation itself. So I'm very confident that this will be done. We have to maintain a balance. But of course, central is the protection of the rights of our personnel that are serving in the Defence Forces, but also to ensure that we maintain the capacity to deliver our outputs as assigned. And I think we can do both, and I'm confident we can get there. It takes, like anything, good negotiations, and it takes good, proper thought and analysis to do so, and I'm confident we will get there at the end of the day with it. And finally, on Callbrewer Barracks, you will be aware that there is a feasibility study that is underway right now that has been set up to establish the feasibility of Callbrewer Barracks in terms of if to move it somewhere else, if you like. Can I say also that Callbrewer Barracks is a live operational barracks, and that means that people work there and they live there. And to move the barracks means moving where people live also. And that's something that can often be lost in translation during these discussions. That's the first thing. But the feasibility study, as agreed interdepartmentally to be undertaken, will look at the totality of that. It'll look at the totality of the security implications from the city. It'll look at from the security implications from the Defence Forces and our ability to provide that same to the critical infrastructures within the city itself, and what are the alternatives for it. I'll await the outcome of that with interest, and when it does come, of course, I'll engage with it, and we will see where that brings us at that point in time. And I wouldn't like to be preemptive or prejudicial to the outcome of that feasibility study at this point in time, if that's okay with the Deputy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Yeah, well, I'll come back to Deputy Brady before we conclude, because I have a number of members who are offering, who haven't had the opportunity yet of asking a question.
These are questions I had previously asked, Chair, and whether the Chief I asked a question about morale. I
give you 30 seconds. Just
I outlined the nature of the question already. Morale, UNDOF, and the board it opposes in the Court, just to get his view on them. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And maybe I'd ask the Chief to revert to those in the context of the replies to the next round of questions, because I'm very keen to include as many members as are offering. Commencing the next round with Deputy Berry, followed by Deputy Stanton, Senator Clonan and Senator Crockwell. And then I'll come back to Deputy Brady, and Deputy Clark is offering again too. Thank you. Deputy Berry.
Chair. I'm just going to ask 6 brief questions here. I'm just conscious of my colleagues trying to get in. If there is a second round, I'd be very happy to come in as well. Lieutenant General Clancy, you're very welcome to you and to your team. And just to double on what Deputy Clerk was saying, thank you for the hospitality that was extended to the committee and our visits to Haulbowline, to the Naval Base, to the Defence Forces Training Centre in Curra, and to Casement Aerodrome in Baldonnel as well. So it's great we're in a position to reciprocate a small bit of hospitality today for a change, which is good. Just my first question is in relation to capability. Obviously, we're all aware of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. We would hope there'd be a peaceful solution tomorrow, but I think we're all realistic that it's unlikely to happen. In fact, the trajectory we're on, the trend line we're on, is actually non-reassuring. It's actually more likely that the conflict is going to widen and escalate rather than de-escalate. So I guess it'd be good to get the Chief's professional assessment in how this country can protect itself in the event of the conflict widening. So I guess the specific question is, do we have a national defence plan, and is it adequately resourced? So that's pretty much the first question. The remaining 5 really have to do with retention, which I would say is far more important than recruitment. Just to double on Deputy Brady's question about the housing situation in the Curra, but also beyond that from a Defence Force perspective, there's 77 family homes which are unoccupied as part of the defence estate at the moment, 62 of which are in the Curra. And I accept they're in various states of disrepair. And we very much welcome what the Taoiseach said in the Dáil Chamber about a month ago now, where he changed the policy. That he said that we're going to be looking at having families living on base in future, which is a very, very welcome development. I guess my question to the Chief is, where are we with implementation of that new policy? And specifically, that might focus the answer, by the end of this year, does he envisage any of those houses being back on track? Because housing obviously is a massively topical issue, and rightly so, currently in the country. The third question is really about private medical care. Currently commissioned officers are getting it, but enlisted personnel aren't. Again, we welcome the defence estimates. The Taoiseach was before this very committee only a few weeks ago, and the estimate is 5 million has been set aside, provision for 2023, this tax year, this budgetary year. I guess my question to the Chief is there a launch date for this? When will private medical care be available to enlisted personnel? Obviously, we would say the sooner the better. We know that our enlisted personnel get injured, and they shouldn't really be out of pocket when it comes to paying for their surgical operations, whether it's knees or hips or whatever. Next question about pay, and I do acknowledge there's been some small improvements at the lower end of the scale. So if you've less than 3 years service, there has been small improvements there, which I do welcome, and the committee no doubt welcomes as well. But there hasn't been any improvement really specific to the Defence Forces beyond that. The Commissioner of the Defence Force did mention and did recommend improvements on patrol duty allowance for the Naval Service. So we're hearing indications that it could be doubled in the next little while. I don't think that's sufficient. I think it should be quadrupled because it's such a small allowance. But is that the case? And when will the final decision be made from a patrol duty allowance point of view? The Commission also recommended long service increments for those with long service, but we don't see any implementation of that yet. So where are we with that process? Thirdly, the Commission recommended about 840, if I recall, Lance Corporal positions. So obviously they're important in their own right, but it would allow senior privates to get a bit of a pay rise if they were promoted to Lance Corporal. When are we likely to see the first Lance Corporal in the Irish Defence Forces? And then there's an issue that's been mentioned here before, is apprentice and cadet pay. They don't get military service allowance, and we know apprentices are actually, for the first 2 years, they're actually on less than €20,000. What would the Chief's view on that be, and could military service allowance be extended to apprentices and cadets? And remember, the cadets were used during the COVID pandemic, so they were deployed operationally from a contact tracing point of view. Lastly, from a retention point of view, it's been mentioned here before, and I guess a number of serving personnel have been in touch with a number of deputies and senators in the committee here. If you joined the Defence Force before 1994 and you're a private or a corporal, you can serve to the age of 60. So we accept the principle that there's privates and there's corporals currently serving in the military who are 60 years of age. But if you joined after 1994, you must retire at the age of 50. And perhaps that was a rational rule when it was brought in the 1990s, but to me I don't think it's appropriate anymore. So what would the Chief's view on that be, and can we at least pause the implementation of this rule pending review? I know that Taoiseach was here, and to read his body language, he was open-minded at the prospect. If we're trying to keep people in the Defence Forces, we shouldn't be driving them out. People who want to stay, provided they're medically fit, they should be allowed to stay, I would certainly argue. And then the last point then, just on gender, Chair, if I may. I take the Chief's point that 6%, or you said 7% of the Defence Forces are female, and that's not appropriate. We would like that to be much higher. But I think we should bear in mind as well the gender balance in the Defence Forces is better than that in midwifery. It's better than in nursing. It's better than on building sites. So while we do want to improve it, and it is at a low base, we're not the only, or the Defence Force isn't the only organisation in this situation. I think we should be mindful of that. You mentioned 7% on average, but my understanding, General, is that there's a higher percentage in the Defence Force band of females. There's a higher percentage of females in the Reserve Defence Force. So what I would extrapolate from that is, if you provide an environment where there's regular working hours, which is compliant with the European Work Time Directive, when you're not sent overseas with a couple of days' notice, it's likely to attract more female participation. And so if you have those percentages, even approximate ones, it would be certainly helpful. And then lastly, just from a gender point of view, is what is the gender pay gap in the Defence Forces currently? I know obviously it's an issue across society where males are paid more than females. So what is the gender pay gap in the Defence Forces? That's all I have, Chair. And if there's a second round, I'd be very happy to come in.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Mayor. Deputy Stanton.
Thanks very much. Again, I want to thank the Chief of Staff for welcoming me here, and your colleagues as well. And thank you for a very good presentation, very positive and I think far-seeing presentation. Many of the questions I was going to ask have been asked, so I won't repeat them. But I just want to ask the Chief about the issue of diversity and inclusion. Just today, as we speak, in fact, the action plan against racism is being launched. And could the Chief maybe talk about racism isn't mentioned in your presentation? Inclusion is and diversity is, and I'm sure it's implied. But I'd like you to maybe take a moment to comment on the number of people from other diverse backgrounds that are actually in the Defence Forces, from other nationalities and so on, and what's the policy with respect to that to encourage such people to join and be part of the Defence Forces? Could I ask about the naval service and the current situation regarding the number of ships that can actually go to sea at any one time right now? And we speak about the ambition, and I agree with you there, but am I right in saying that it depends on the number of specialists that are available? And what are the plans to retain the specialists? Have we been looking at retention payments? I know there are some already there. How are they working? And I know there's an international experience that it's kind of mixed. I've looked at some of the research there in that, but it's something that's been examined to actually encourage people to stay on, especially people with specialist skills that are absolutely essential, no matter how many other people you have, to actually take the ships to sea. Could I ask the Chief about the head of transformation and where that's at the moment? How many applications, can you tell us, have been received with respect to that particular post, which was advertised a little while ago? What's the remuneration for that post? Well, that's what you can tell us, but I'd just be curious, because I'm aware in other organisations that that's a very important job. Is it going to be a temporary job, time limited for a number of months or years? Because it implies that when you transform an organisation, the job is done, or is it going to be an ongoing transformation? My understanding of these roles would be that once the transformation occurs, it has occurred, the main bulk of it, and then people in that role very often in other organisations move on. They don't actually stay put. Also, the head of strategic HR, where's that at the moment? The same questions apply there. I guess that would be a longer term role, but you might tell me about that. Could I ask about recruitment, and in particular about how the amount of time it takes from when somebody makes an initial application to when they're actually attested? Now, my understanding is it can take quite a while, and during that interval, that person might move on to other things. And could I ask in particular as well, just focusing on the the aptitude tests, aptitude psychometric tests. I had some questions now that I'm sure you're aware of there in the past. I was told in 2021 that 4,408 aptitude tests were administered. And the number of those that failed were 2,178, more than half of those who took them failed. Now, if there's a 50% failure rate in aptitude tests, I'd be raising questions as to whether or not, surely be goodness, all the people who actually were interested and went to the trouble of taking the tests were actually interested in joining the Defence Forces, or at least exploring that. And if half of them failed the aptitude test, I wonder if the aptitude test is too hard. Maybe we should all take one here and see how we get on. But it's the same. In 2016, it was again 50% or more failed the aptitude test. Now that seems to me to be. I was told that they're in line with best practice. Now the militaries use such testing in similar manner in their selection processes, but it seems to be very, very high. And I just raised that question. If young people are interested in joining and they hit this hurdle and they can't go any further, maybe it needs to be looked at, or maybe the chief knows something that I don't know about this and probably do. I think that's kind of it. I think most of the other questions that I wanted to ask have been asked already, so I won't repeat them, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Senator. Senator Crockwell, followed by Senator Tonin.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Chair, at the outset I want to place on record my I suppose, concern over the fact that we all received a letter prior to the Chief of Staff arriving here, not to stray into policy areas. I believe the Chief of Staff, as the most senior military officer in the country, is well capable of telling us if we stray into areas that we're not or should not stray into. And with that in mind, I'm somewhat concerned at the blurring that I've noticed and other people have mentioned to me of the roles within the senior Department of Defence and the Chief of Staff's office. We see the Secretary General taking security briefings. It's my understanding, Chief, that it is your job to offer security advice to the Minister of the day. And it has been said to me on one particular occasion, or said in my company, sure, anybody could be the Chief of Staff. I'm sure you wouldn't agree with that statement, and I just want to have your view on that. Now, you spoke about the centenary of commemorations, and indeed the Defence Forces did a tremendous job over the centenary of commemorations. However, I participated in a commemoration in Glasnevin later last year to commemorate some 1,000 members of the National Army who died in the Civil War. And no colour party was provided for that. And it caused a lot of distress to families. And I wonder, somebody told me, and I don't know where it came from, but somebody said that it was the position of the Defence Forces that this would have been a misuse of resources. I have never known the military to refuse a colour party for any commemorative ceremony, so I would be interested in your views on that. One of my colleagues mentioned the dreaded issue of medals, and I'm looking at veterans' issues here at the moment. I would ask you, Chief, if the Defence Forces is prepared to do what military all over the world have done and look back at acts of valour carried out by members of the Defence Forces. I'm particularly one of my own former battalion, Billy Cadian, who lost his life in the Lebanon, having set out to rescue or to warn colleagues of incoming mortars. Billy lost his life, and all that was awarded to him was the Military Star. Dick O'Hanlon and Martin Fahy from Galway and two other colleagues under fire rescued the former Sergeant Major Twenty O'Connor and got him to a medical aid post and saved his life. And there are countless stories of this type, leaving aside the dreaded Jadaville, which I believe has never been dealt with correctly, and I know we'll probably differ on that, and I'm happy enough with that. But isn't it time that we looked back at acts of valour that took place and commemorated those men, and it was mainly men at that time, who put their lives on the line in order to save a comrade and see to it that they are properly recognised for that. I think it's extremely distressing that we haven't done that for quite a number of those men. The other thing that you mentioned there during your presentation, that any member of this committee and any former member of the Defence Forces is welcome in any barracks in the country. I have to say, I have on my desk now 30 sergeant majors, BQs, RSMs, who are meeting, trying to come up with a veterans charter that they would advise the veterans organisations, yourself and the department on. These are all the most senior non-commissioned officers in the Defence Forces, and they have been refused accommodation in any barracks for a meeting. Now, I have actually funded one of those meetings myself, and I think that is outrageous that men who and women who reach those ranks in the non-commissioned ranks are being refused accommodation in a barracks to hold a meeting. They're not going to run away with the silverware or anything like that. On the operational side, my colleagues have mentioned the subsurface cables and the need for, if you want, subsurface surveillance. And I'm just wondering, has there been a revision of your procurement requirements for subsurface surveillance, both for the Navy and for the Air Corps? I believe the new aircraft that are coming online will be capable of carrying out subsurface observations. I want to move on now to the 2013 pension. Do you believe, General Clancy, that the 2013 pension scheme is actually detrimental to the retention of troops in service in the organisation? For the life of me, I know from my time in the Teachers' Union of Ireland that the revision of pensions that took place from 1996 and again in, I think it was 99 and again in 2013, each one of those have cut more and more and more into the pension schemes and have caused serious concern. But no profession is forced to retire at 50 other than the Defence Forces right now. And given that you can't draw down your supplementary pension while you're waiting to reach the age of 60, that's going to be a serious problem. And I think an awful lot of your young officers particularly are looking to a couple of years, a bit of service overseas, and then move straight into the civil service. And if we look in recent times, a significant number of commissioned officers have moved into the civil service. On the side of the non-commissioned officers, a lot of them who reach pension age are finding that the civil service is not an option for them because they're being hit with pension abatement, which is outrageous. The Working Time Directive, are you seeking any exemptions from that? And if you are, how many? And why would you be seeking those? I do understand there are operational issues that might cause you problems, and you might just outline those for the committee here. Now I'm coming to an end. The Army Ranger Wing, two issues on that. One is the allowances which have remained unpaid for years. What's your position on that? And the second one is, we've had a number of situations where the Gardaí have been sent overseas to look after ministers when they're travelling to Ukraine. Why not the Army Ranger Wing? Surely that is their role. They were sent to Afghanistan. They were good enough for that. So why are we not using them for trips to Ukraine? And the final one, which is of concern to a lot of serving soldiers, I'm told, is those that are being pulled out of UN duties to join a European battle group. Are they going to lose out on allowances when they join a battle group? I'm sorry there's so many questions there, and you'll understand, Chief, a lot of them are not my questions, but coming from former members of the Defence Forces, particularly on the veterans issues, and colleagues then that I would have known down through the years that are concerned about the direction which they think the Defence Forces is being driven. And if it is being driven in that direction, you're the one who has to save this, and I appreciate throwing these questions at you when you're only a short time in office is probably difficult, but I appreciate you taking the time. And I should put on record the tremendous job you did and the organisation did for Private Rooney and his family. It was one of the most moving days that I've been involved in a long, long time. What we do is we do look after our people very, very well, and I want to congratulate you and the entire staff on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Cockburn. Senator Clonan, followed by a brief supplementary. Deputy Carr.
Guramagat, Chair. Agus Gun Úsal, Fáilseoir of Galer, Gadi Chachline. It's a very special moment for me to meet the General Staff, having served myself as an officer in the Defence Forces. I'll try to be brief. A lot of questions have been asked of you. My primary interest is in the culture of the Defence Forces, and you referenced women of honour. As you know, and as everybody in this room knows, the revelations about serious sexual violence, sexual assault and rape didn't begin with women of honour. It began 25 years ago when I sat down with your predecessor, Lieutenant General Jerry McMahon, in his office as a serving officer, and I set out the very serious challenges that confronted Óglaigh na hÉireann at that time with regard to explicitly discriminatory policies and practices as they applied to female personnel. Now, my research, which was published in 2000, is a very, very detailed document which sets out in forensic detail the causes and patterns of gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence within the Defence Forces. Sexual assault and rape. It's not about sexual harassment or bullying. I think we need to be really careful about language. It's about the darkest forms of sexual violence. And these aren't gender issues. These are issues of the most serious criminal nature. And I set that out in very great detail 23 years ago. Now, with the fresh disclosures made by Women of Honour, I was contacted by the former Minister for Defence, Michael Smith, Fianna Fáil Minister for Defence. And I want to set the record straight here. I demanded the independent government inquiry into my research. I did. And the study review group was set up at my behest to investigate my research. And it reported in 2003 and fully vindicated my findings in stating that not only were women in the Defence Forces subjected to sexual violence, sexual assault and rape, but also some male soldiers. Now, the reason why Michael Smith contacted me was because he wanted to express his sadness that even though he and I had given the warning very, very clearly 23 years ago, that it would appear to be the case that your culture, our culture, has not changed. And I would ask you, my first question is, to make a statement on that or give a comment. Why do you think my research was, completely and utterly ignored? That's the first question. My second question is, why was so much energy invested by, and it's almost exclusively a phenomenon amongst officers, why has there been so much reprisal targeted at me and other people who speak up about sexual violence, sexual assault and rape in the Defence Forces? Why have I been targeted? Why was my family targeted? Now, your predecessor, Mark Mellett, did, when I met him in 2019, give an expression of regret at the way I and my family had been treated, being the target of reprisal, which is ongoing, I'm sorry to say, shamefully. He said that he couldn't give an expression, he couldn't give an apology because some of the people who were involved in that reprisal are still serving. And in fact, Chief, some of them have been promoted to very senior rank. So he said he couldn't apologise for that reason. But I'm asking you, would you, on behalf of the Defence Forces, apologise to me and my family for the reprisal that was visited upon me? and my family over the years, because my crime, if I might put it in that way, was to speak out about sexual violence. And one of the things that puzzles me over the years is, why is so much energy in military culture expended on reprisal, if even a fraction of that energy was directed at identifying and bringing the perpetrators to some sort of justice? The problem would be alleviated. But no. So Michael Smith, in his conversation with me, he said that, he was one of the first ministers to introduce a reduction in the alcohol limits for driving. And he said he took great satisfaction over the years in seeing the numbers of deaths on the roads related to alcohol intake reducing. In other words, we stopped harm. But his sadness and my shared sadness is that despite the very explicit warning that I gave you all 23 years ago, hundreds of young men and women have been exposed to life-limiting and life-altering experiences because no action was taken. And in fact, what we did experience was cancellation, reprisal, gaslighting, the downplaying of this problem. So I would ask you to make a statement about that, about whether or not I and my family will get an apology for that. I think an expression of regret isn't enough. The other question I have for you is, what's your feeling about the independent review group? How do you think that report is going to reflect on the culture of the Defence Forces? And if, as I suspect, it's going to show that not only has the culture not changed, that it may in fact have deteriorated, what does that say about military management over the last 20 years? And who should be held accountable for that? And my final question for you is, a number of challenges have been highlighted here around, the situation in Ukraine. And I agree with Deputy Berry, it is going to escalate. There's a serious risk there. But I would say to you, the most serious existential challenge to the future of Óglaigh na hÉireann is its own culture, its lack of diversity, the fact that it does not reflect the society which it is charged to protect and serve. Karina Malloy, in her recently published book, says, after 39 years of service in the Defence Forces, that she says it is not a safe place for women. I concur with that view based on my own research, which is evidence-based, and based on all of the revelations that have been disclosed to me on foot of the Women of Honour's disclosures. So, if it is an unsafe place for 51% of the population, how can you purport to protect and serve the Republic? How can you send troops overseas where you have vulnerable women and children in hostile environments, when you have an organisation that would appear to be, well, according to the evidence, an unsafe place for women? And before you answer any of those questions, the final thing I want to say is that I know that you're a person of absolute integrity, and that aside from Mark Mellett, you're the first Chief of Staff to acknowledge and actually speak directly to the Women of Honour and to acknowledge explicitly the problem that exists within the organisation. I also believe that Jackie McCrum, the Secretary-General of the Department of Defence, is also a person who is absolutely committed to transforming the culture of the Defence Forces. And this is a situation that you have inherited, and I wish you the very, very best of luck in dealing with it and bringing the organisation forward. But mark my words, what is coming next with the Independent Review Group and its report will be a watershed moment for the Defence Forces. And I would ask you not to invest your energies in trying to engage in pushback or denial or reprisal or cancellation or gaslighting of any of the people who raise red flags, but instead invest your energies in bringing the transformation of culture within the Defence Forces, which must happen if you're to become effective in your mission or as an organisation in itself.
Okay.
conscious of the fact that some of the issues that have been raised by Senator Clonan will be beyond the remit of the Chief of Staff to give a comprehensive answer towards, and I'm sure Senator Clonan knew that when he was framing the questions in any event, but I don't intend to in any way intervene in the manner of the replies on the part of the Chief of Staff. Deputy Clerk indicated earlier that she had supplemented. Okay. I call Senator
Very
Wilson.
cordial here.
No, Deputy Clerk.
The first supplementary question, Chief, that I would like to ask is in relation to your opening statement, where you referenced the emergency accommodation in a number of military installations as the continuing to lead or to support lead agencies around those seeking international protection. The one barracks in particular, Column Barracks in Mullingar, is now being used or will be used to house those coming to our shores seeking refuge. Was that decision made by the General Staff or was it made by the Department? I ask because there was zero correspondence with the over 30 community groups that operate out of that barracks. Secondly, I want to go back to the Commission report for the moment. The Commission report was published in February 2022. All in all, I had 130 recommendations, including the sub-recommendations. We've had a Commission report, a high-level action plan, an implementation management office, an implementation oversight group, a high-level steering board, and what the Taoiseach referred to a number of weeks ago, which is echoed in the statement you've made as well, a work-in-progress implementation plan. Seeing as we're 9 months past the high-level action plan being published, is that pace adequate to address the level of change that's needed within the Defence Forces? And finally, I want to touch on the issue of protected disclosures in light of the imminent IRG report. When the Protected Disclosure Amendment Act of 2022 was passed, did that have any impact on how the Defence Forces deal with protected disclosures being made? I note in your opening statement, and in fairness, Tom has referred to it here as well, the Women of Honour. It was in January 2017 that Yvonne O'Rourke highlighted the abuse, the discrimination and the bullying that she had experienced in the cadet school. Now, it's my understanding that she had been told that her protected disclosure was subjective. To me, that is reflective of the word that Tom has used there, gaslighting. And in fact, prior to the documentary by Katie Hannon on RTE, Yvonne had requested repeated meetings, all of which were refused until after the airing of that documentary. So who is responsible for handling protected disclosures in the Defence Forces? Is it the Department or is it General Staff? And also on the same issue of Yvonne O'Rourke, is the Ombudsman for the Irish Defence Forces fit for purpose? When Yvonne O'Rourke took her case to the WRC, that ruled that systemic discrimination had been determined, there was a number of points instructed to the Defence Forces to undertake. Can you give an update as to whether any of those instructed pieces of work have been undertaken? And who is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the information provided to the ODF from the Department of Defence is true and accurate, or is there any work carried out to determine the truthfulness or the accuracy? Is it the General Staff or is it the Department of Defence? And finally, can the committee have your reaction, please, to the finding earlier this month in relation to the Air Corps chemical exposure, where the Air Corps failed to comply with a Supreme Court ruling to provide safety documentation as part of discovery? It's quite a damning statement made by the judge. Your feedback will be very much appreciated.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'd like to join my colleagues in welcoming you, Lieutenant General Clancy, and your colleagues here this afternoon, and to thank you for answering the questions that have been put to you to date. I know we're under time constraints, so a lot of the questions that I wanted to ask have already been asked. We've all been contacted by various groups, representative bodies and others. So just to join with other colleagues in thanking you and your colleagues for their hospitality shown to us on our visits to the various locations throughout the country. And Mr. Chairman, we look forward to visiting a number of others before the end of this year, hopefully. Just in relation to the closure of barracks, Lieutenant General, in March 2012, Dooney Neal Barracks in Cavan Town was closed, along with barracks in Mullingar, which has been referred to by Deputy Clerk just a few moments ago, and Clonmel. And this resulted in 500 personnel being redeployed. At the time of these closures, the number of full-time personnel was 9,458. It is now 8,000 odd. Perhaps you could clarify for us what the exact number of personnel, active personnel, within the Defence Forces is at present. Could I ask you, do you have a view as to the impact of barrack closures on recruitment and retention? I welcome the Commission on the Defence Forces recommendation that the Defence Forces strength be increased to 11,500 by 2028. Increasing the Defence Forces to that number will require additional accommodation and facilities, and you've alluded to that in your contribution here this afternoon. Could I put it to you that Dooney Neal Barracks in Cavan, which is, by the way, the only purpose-built barracks in the history of the state, the most modern in Europe at the time, with accommodation for over 200 personnel, equipment and a helicopter base. Could I put it to you that this would be an ideal barracks for reopening, given its location at the point midway between Finnoy Camp and County Donegal in the northwest and Aiken Barracks in Dundalk on the east coast. In relation to ministerial reviews that are carried out before personnel are deployed overseas, I recall being at one in Cavan in the late 1990s, where Minister Smith presided over it, who has already been referred to here by my colleague Senator Clonan. And that was a huge spectacle and had a massive impact on the community of Cavan. People travelled from way outside the hinterland of Cavan to attend that parade. And as a result of that, there was a spike in recruitment to the Defence Forces, the Army in particular. Could I ask you, would you give consideration to conducting such reviews in future in areas where Army barracks are not located, and if that could be considered by you or through you by the Minister and the Department? And finally, could I just say that since its closure in 2012, I've raised in the Senate on numerous occasions the possibility of reopening Dooney Neal Barracks. However, I didn't get very positive responses. But I'm glad that the mindset may be changing, because in recent replies in 2022 by Minister Coveney and a number of weeks ago, another reply to my colleague Brendan Smithy, the present Minister in Taoiseach, left open the door to the possibility of the barracks reopening. And my final question to you, Lieutenant General, is would you support such a move? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Wilson. I know the Chief of Staff has a list of a significant number of questions before him. I'm going to invite him to reply, but I'm also going to suggest that he might group the questions into various sections, because there has been something of an overlap, and there have been a number of very important questions that I'm sure members would wish to seek replies to. But before going back to the Chief, it has been indicated by Senator Crockwell that he has a brief supplementary question, which I will allow.
Just very quickly, we've had significant vacancies in particularly non-commissioned officers' ranks. Based on my colleague Senator Clonan's comments, would you accept that the lack of supervision because of vacancies not being filled is contributing in some way to the difficulties outlined by Senator Clonan, that we simply don't have enough people on the ground to maintain discipline and good order? Thank you.
Thank you. And could I ask the Chief, in the context of his replies, just from my own part, I don't wish to be repetitive, but there were a number of important issues raised earlier, not least by Deputy Brady when he said at the outset of the meeting that we, as members of the Parliamentary Committee, are firmly of the view that morale in the Defence Forces is low, and that this is obviously a priority of your tenure and also a priority of government. And I would ask, in the context, for example, of recruitment, having regard to the fact that there are competitive issues in relation to the private sector, having regard to the fact that we interviewed members of the Defence Forces who were strongly of the view that they would have a more secure future and a more attractive future in another army, in another jurisdiction. In your opening statement, you spoke about the need for a competitive edge. And I'm wondering, in the context of your replies to earlier questions, could I ask you to include do you have a confidence that you will be in a position to turn matters round, having regard to the issue of morale striking at the fundamentals of service in our defence forces, and you know how you would see yourself setting about that task, working with the Department of Defence, with the Taoiseach, having regard to the fact that the objective is similar, and that is to ensure a raising or heightening of morale within the Defence Forces. And could I ask you to briefly revisit an issue referred to by Deputy Lawless, and that is in the context of capacity and an ability to monitor, for example, the undersea telecommunications network, the importance of which has always been in evidence, but the urgency to be in a position to protect our waters is obviously heightened now in the context of the changed circumstances in Europe. We see, for example, what happened to undersea cables off the coast of Taiwan, with particular reference to China. We've seen numerous incidents over the past 18 months in the Baltic Sea, with particular reference to the current conflict in Ukraine. And perhaps you could enlighten us as to, you know, how you see yourself managing, having regard to the fact that a sum of money has now been made available, which was long overdue in the context of the purchase of new equipment. But what element of planning or indeed contingency planning have you in place to ensure the protection of our waters, with particular reference to the undersea telecommunications network serving not only Ireland but also the United Kingdom and in many respects mainland Europe also? Thanks, Chief. Give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the deputies for their questions. And there is, as the chairman said, there's quite an extensive amount, so I hope I can get through them all, and I'm sure we can revert back if I have a miss out on any of them. But as I said at the beginning, I'll do my. And since you pointed me back towards the optimistic, how optimistic or otherwise I am, and Deputy Brady's question, which you came back to, let me start there. you have visited all the barracks and you have got a sense, I suppose, of the pulse and the temperature in each of those, and you referred to that, Mr. Chairman, yourself. But I too have visited every single barracks on more than one occasion, as you would appreciate. I've sat with groups, individuals of all shapes and sizes within our organisation to discuss how their sense of it and where they're at. And I think I can say with a degree of confidence that everybody's goodwill in terms of the Defence Forces succeeding is there. And I think that's the fundamental underlying tenet that I'd like to get across today, that every woman and every man in our organisation is determined for the Defence Forces to succeed. And irrespective of the challenges that we have faced and we continue to face, everybody understands those. But more importantly, and when I come to being, whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about morale, I'm optimistic about it. Because what the Commission has done and the manner in which we have articulated that, and part of my priorities is the internal communication. I didn't say external communication with the Defence Forces. And I'm not very prolific in terms of my external communication, and that's very much deliberate on my part. Because for me, my priority is communicating to the internal audience, to those women and men that I serve today. And as a consequence, it's important to me that they understand fully what is under development, the opportunities that are there, and give them reason to be optimistic about the future for the Defence Forces. That's my role, but it's also my duty to them, each and every one of them. And I plan to continue to fulfil that as long as I'm in this role. Because to set out my priorities in the manner in which I've done, to try and increase the resources in the manner in which I've explained in terms of platforms, in terms of what we do and our raison d'etre and why we do it, and to communicate that internally so people understand the duty of service internally and how important that is. And for me, that leads inevitably and should lead to increased morale. And you've got a sense of where morale is right now. And as Deputy Berry has pointed out, we have had some wins around, in particular, those most vulnerable within our organisation. And under the high-level action plan, those wins were very deliberately targeted for our most vulnerable to try and give us that competitive edge, because we did experience high losses in training, for instance, and high losses in those early years, formative years of Defence Forces service in that year 1 to 3. And the inhibitors around, and the freedom, if you like, now around military service allowance, around standing still, which the barriers which have been removed introduced from that service area in terms of that initial part, can be seen, come to fruition now in terms of the total value package. And as I mentioned at the outset, pay and conditions is part of that total values package. And we can see now that a 3-star recruit after 24 weeks training can start on a pay packet of 37,149 odd euros. We see a cadet, non-graduate on 42,000 odd and a graduate cadet on 44,000. And I think there isn't anybody here that would argue that they're not comparable in terms of the wider civil and public sector in terms of starting salaries. And so therefore that's only one element. But the cultural element which Senator Cloonan has so eloquently articulated that exists in our organisation, and I do recognise it fully, and I think you appreciate the fact that I fully recognise it. And I continue to do so, and I won't shirk from my responsibilities in terms of addressing the cultural issues that exist in our organisation today. And I cannot say it often enough. Everybody has the right to come to work every day and receive dignity and receive respect. But they should also show that. And I've also said, the women and men of Oireachtas Nahearn today, that the majority of those people are good people that do that. I've also recognised the fact that we have sexual harassment. I've said openly that includes rape. And I have no difficulty saying that. And I recognise that. And it has been existent for a considerable period of time. I would suggest it's longer than 23 years. I would suggest it goes back much further than that, as a Ruth Fitzgerald report, which covered the period 1950 to 1994, has captured in her report, which was published yesterday afternoon. The independent monitoring groups, of course, that succeeded, if you will, your period in terms of your report, and I address your comments on this, Senator, under the IMG reports of 2002, 2004, after the Challenger Workplace 2002, 2008, 2014, some of which were consequential to the work that you had done at that time, which I have also recognised in my commentaries over this last time in my office. I face these problems as a Chief of Staff today. I faced them as Sean Clancy, as General in charge of Oireachtas Nahearn today. I cannot undo the past, but I can certainly change the present with a view to creating an environment and an atmosphere and a service conditions and a workplace that gives equality, diversity, respect, dignity to all of those who serve. And I, along with all of my staff, and I think every member, good person in Oireachtas today, shares that view and shares that ambition. I'm confident that we will continue to work day and night to achieve that. And it is our priority, I can assure you, as it has been since the day I took office. I didn't see this as a challenge when I took office. I very openly articulated that this was an opportunity, because I will serve, all things being equal, I will serve for at least 5 years as Chief of Staff, and it's my intention to see that through. And my key priority from day one has been the opportunity presented by those such as yourself and the Women of Honour who have articulated their experiences. And through my engagement with groups of individuals, with individuals, male and female in our organisation, who have in confidence and very sensitively articulated to me their lived experiences in our organisation. So I'm under no illusion with regards to the issues that exist today and that have existed in the past in our organisation. But I have a determination, and I know I share it with the Secretary-General, which brings me to the point that you have raised, Senator Crockwell, about the greyness. I think the greyness that exists is healthy. I think we have too many closed views sometimes with regards, and the Secretary-General and I share a determination to change the culture within the organisation. As you know, I do not control all of the power within our organisation. I have certain responsibilities, but there are other responsibilities that she has and shares. And together, the combination of those responsibilities, I'm sure, will help enhance our overall development, well-being and outputs from the Defence Forces. And that is my goal. And that is quite simple in that respect. The Secretary-General is, of course, entitled to receive security briefings. She cannot do her role or her job. We fulfil our role in terms of advising government and advising the Taoiseach and Minister. You will be well aware of the rules that govern the Minister. When the Secretary-General speaks, she speaks on behalf of the Minister. She is entitled to and needs security briefings to fulfil her role. The perspective that that's taken in terms of the traditional sense was perhaps, it's not an opinion I will care to express any view on, other than I know my responsibilities. And I have no difficulty whatsoever in the manner in which the Secretary-General is conducting myself. And I was very deliberate in my remarks in my opening statement. The shared views, the relationship that is extremely positive, I have found to be most productive in terms of the output and the advancements of the organisation as a whole. And the Defence Forces is my primary goal, and the advancement of the Defence Forces in its transformative period, which it is now. And if we are to seize the opportunity that transformation is offering us today, we have to maximise everybody's effort, including that of the Secretary-General and the civilian team in her midst. And that's my determination to do so on it. Let the Secretary go water for a moment and then continue. I'll try and take the questions then in sequence if I can. There was a question about the houses in terms of, I think Deputy Berry raised it, and I think also Deputy Brady brought it up also with regards to it. I just, with regards to the Taoiseach has been very clear with regards to the DFTC in particular, which was subsequent to your question, I think, Deputy Berry. But in a holistic sense, firstly, there is no reverse of policy that I'm aware of when it comes to the housing and the long-standing policy which was introduced in the 90s, if I recall, and there is no reversal of that particular policy. However, the Taoiseach has been very clear that there will not be any demolition of any housing estate that's within the Defence Force at this point in time. We are tasked with refurbishing, repurposing where necessary, But let me talk in a holistic sense around the Defence Forces. We have a requirement to accommodate quite a large number of our personnel, those that are most vulnerable that I spoke to earlier on, our new trainees, our new inductees, our young personnel in our organisation. To that end, our infrastructure development plan speaks very clearly in terms of where our priorities are at this point in time. The Taoiseach has made it very clear he wants all of the housing estate to be refurbished and repurposed if necessary, or reallocated, if you will. And I think that's a very positive development, and your question, I think, brought that out into the open. The infrastructural development plan, as I said, lays down our priorities, and you can see from that plan that we have created accommodation, new accommodation, refurbished accommodation in Caldbrewer Barracks. We've done the same in Baldonnel. I think we have probably one of the most state-of-the-art accommodation facilities provided for sailors in Hallbowlen, that was opened only a number of months ago. Having viewed that, having been there at the very inception of that in my previous role, and accelerating the development of that area, I'm very proud. I think the Defence Forces and the Naval Service can be very proud of the accommodation and the standard that's now provided there. We also have a plan around the rehousing that's under discussion in the DFTC in particular. We have a plan for another 100-bed accommodation there in the DFTC. And our new joint training and induction centre in Gormanston, of course, will need accommodation to enhance its current capacity, which is limited, to grow it to the level of campus level, which is my vision for that induction centre, to create a centre of excellence where we have all our training up to 2-star initial training, induction training is set in that centre. So we have commonality of standard, we have efficiency of instruction, we have governance structures that we can stand over, and we have an infrastructure that is commensurate with 22nd century. And to that end, we will be creating, in my vision, a campus whereby we create an alternative outlet, if you like, for students and for others coming from second level into a third level, that we know we need to draw and attract and give us that competitive edge, if you will. So that centre of excellence, in due course, the ambition is to achieve that and to achieve that vision. And I think that will give us one level in terms of the supports, in terms of the outcome and the draw and attractiveness of our institution in that space. And I think that will be very helpful. But there's no question that the accommodation that we have and the quarters that we have do need refurbishment. But we also have a finite capital investment programme, and we have a finite financial purse, if you will. That falls within the remit, of course, of the Secretary-General. I don't want to digress into that. But the infrastructure development plan is a civil-military agreed plan, and all of those considerations come into it. But as I said, Taoiseach has made it very clear with regards to the stock we hold, and the fact that a lot of it, as you rightly pointed out, is in a high state of disrepair, and he wants that rectified. And I think we're engaged fully in the planning around that system. Just on the PDA that you raised also, that is very much an early action piece. It was built around the simplification, if you will, of the number of actual allowances that exist currently for the Naval Service, and to bring about one central allowance under the umbrella of the patrol duty itself. There's a considerable amount of work has been done on that. We have come to a kind of an agreed position, if you will, in terms of how to achieve that. And I know that there's active engagement, which I understand is very positive engagement with the public expenditure reform on how to finalise that piece. I cannot give you a timeline on it. That is outside my gift, because I don't have a determining factor or an influence on that process that lies between the Department of Defence and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. You asked a question around LSI and the Lance Corporal. The LSI was one of the early actions. As you know, this is not something new, if you like, to the Defence Forces in the first instance. They exist in some pay grades. It also exists in the wider public and civil service. Again, this is a pay issue that is not within my gift. However, it is very clearly marked within the Commission of Defence Forces. A full report was done as a consequence of the pay commission, that was the PSPC report that was done at that time, that pointed directly to this issue as well. We have a number of grades that do have LSI, but again, this is something positive that will be developed, and it was to be looked at, if you like, and it has been looked at. The report is done, and now it's into that phase of negotiated space. In the Lance Corporal, that is not one of our early actions, it's one of the later actions, but it's due and scheduled for the implementation plan in, I think approximately, and I can't be certain of this, in the period 2024. So obviously within the implementation plan we have to phase the number of actions because it's simply not possible to do everything at once, and that's why you have an implementation plan that will cover the period out to 2028, and therefore we have to prioritise issues as necessary, and that's where that lies at this point in time. Can I just address the decision on why to withdraw from INDOF, why the decision was undertaken? I think maybe Deputy Brady had made that point. I did at the outset say that we have to rationalise, because we do recognise the strength of the organisation as it stands today versus the establishment of the organisation. I think Deputy Stanton, you asked me the number exactly today. I think it's, I have it here, it's just let me, to be precise for you if I can, I know it's 7,900 in that order. Thank you, 7,917 with our current strength. And it is factors such as that influence decision making. And I also mentioned the fact that stress and strain on the organisation, asking people to double job and to do other jobs that they're with, and all of these things inform the advice that we provide to government and through the Taoiseach on these matters. We have at any one time almost 20% of the Defence Forces, the Army primarily, involved in overseas. That is between those in training, preparing to go overseas, those in the 2 missions that are overseas, and those returning. So in any calendar year, that is an extraordinary level of commitment, and you won't find a commensurate level of commitment perhaps in any other European force at this point in time. So given the numbers are so small in our organisation as well, relatively speaking, that creates an additional burden. And therefore it is incumbent on me and the Defence Forces to look at these parameters, to make difficult decisions. And when we look at UNDOF in particular, it's very technically orientated. The least impact, UNIFIL has a greater level of, if you like, first-time participants in overseas service. There is perhaps in the order of threefold more first-timers that will be in UNIFIL than in UNDOF. So there are many factors, is what I'm saying, Deputy, that come into play when we're making these, creating conditions to give advice and appropriate advice. And for that reasons, that was there. Yes, we have a commitment under the European Battle Group. That is a policy, a government decision, that we will participate commensurate with our participation in the various European treaties. That comes under the next one is coming about in 2024. And again, it's incumbent on the General Staff to review how we can fulfil our task as a task by government. That will be a standby arrangement. It'll be much different to previous battle groups. This one will be covered over a 2-year period. The first year will be in training, and the second year will be on standby. There will be 2 phases of standby, the first 6 months and the second 6 months. In each of those phases, there'll be 2 different exercises. One will be on 30 days' notice to move, the second will be on 10 days' notice to move. So in order to prepare for that, we have to plan now. And therefore, all of these factors, so it's not just the battle group, but it's the wider, I suppose, piece and influences that come into bear when we're trying to come with the appropriate advice that is at this point in time, which we bring forward to government.
So I think it's safe to say the political decision to join the EU battle group, coupled with the political failure to address the retention and recruitment issue, was the tipping point in the decision to withdraw from a peacekeeping mission.
I couldn't possibly comment on that, other than to say that the numbers, to maintain 2 overseas commitments at this point in time, irrespective of battle group, is overstretching the organisation today. So it's irrespective in mind.
Deputy Brady has alternative avenues down which to pursue this issue at any event. And he's already done so, and he will undoubtedly do so again. So I ask you to resume Chief of Staff in the manner in which you deem appropriate.
Thank you. Deputy Berry, the National Defence Plan, of course, is a subordinated plan to the National Security Strategy, which is outside, again, has a security strategy that's under development, and that's something that's in the political domain primarily, and therefore I think it's more appropriately placed in that domain, that question. The private medical care is one that is part of the Commission of the Defence Forces, as you probably are aware. It is also part of Programme for Government. The report around private medical care, its costs and so on and so forth, has been fully completed. It's now in that realm that I spoke to previously in terms of a decision with regards to it's in the civilian DOD and DPER space with regards to finalisation of it. And again, I can't give you it is not within my gift or within my competence to provide you with timelines on that at this point in time. On the question of the heads of the HR, maybe just on Deputy Stanton, I think, was it, in those, that were just on that, both those processes are up and running. So as you alluded to, both those positions were advertised. It's no secret what the commensurate pay is at Assistant Secretary General level. So it's the same as as within the civil service. There were 15 applicants for the strategic HR appointment. There were 30 applicants for the head of transformation. So apart from that, really, as you're aware, that's a confidential process, and I couldn't allude to it any further than that. But to say that I'm satisfied that the process is up and running, and there will be determination within a matter of weeks with regards to the outcomes from those processes, and also to say that both of those appointments will be appointed to and directly reporting to my office, and they will participate on the General Staff Board, and they will be solely responsible on the Defence Forces side, and thereafter they will participate along with the General Staff at the Strategic Management Committee level also. So they will be fully integrated into the organisation, and obviously the expertise that they will bring around transformation and strategic human resources in particular will be of great benefit to the organisation, I hope, in time. Just on the apprentice and cadets, I'll probably just go through them in sequence that I haven't written down if that's preferable. You asked my views. The factual position is that MSA is paid for those that are qualified, as you're well aware. The cadets during the HSE COVID did receive MSA payment for the time frame under which they were engaged on those duties. It is not practice for apprentices or cadets to be involved or engaged in any duties or any operational duties of any kind, and that continues to be, and rightly so, the practice. The apprentices, as you allude to, there's a pay rate associated with apprentices, a pay rate associated with cadetship. And of course, on top of that, they all receive their training, they receive their uniforms and clothing, they receive their accommodation, and they're also in their feeding and so on and so forth. So the general expenses you'd associate with that are all covered within their training package, if you like. So I'm satisfied that the level of that the need for MSA, that we don't associate that with the trainees. I'm satisfied that there's no need to change that. The pay levels associated with apprentice and cadetships is not within my purview, and therefore that is something perhaps that for other discussions, if you will, in terms of that. But I'm satisfied that the accommodation, the clothing, the feeding, the training, and the pay rate that's given is in total is a package that is attractive to any potential candidate for cadetship or apprenticeship within the organisation at this point in time. the question on the gender balance, and thank you for that question. And it's very interesting to hear your view on it and how you have articulated the various challenges in different organisations. Of course, the gender pay gap is something. It's a perspective that you look at it in terms of numbers, or you look at it in terms of just a straight cross gender. We don't have a gender pay gap per se when you look at it. We just have a rate of pay commensurate with a rank associated, and it's gender neutral in that sense. However, the fact that we only have 7%, the pay rates, the majority of pay goes to our male. And when you look at it through that lens, of course, there is a pay gap because we just simply don't have the numbers. I'm very mindful of the research we did around creating an environment to increase the numbers of female participants in the Defence Forces. The Commission of Defence Forces is very clear on that we should have 30 percentile participation, which is a very ambitious level to set from 7%. The Australians, for example, have this agenda underway for over a decade and a half now, and they have achieved, on average, across the 3 services, just under 20% on my last recall of it. So this is not a very easy challenge, but is one we're determined to grow because, as I said, there is a capability gap there, and we need to grow the numbers of female participating in our organisation today. And again, this is something I think will create a level of diversity, as referred to as Deputy Stanton referred to, that is required within the organisation. And that brings me to the diversity and inclusion piece that Deputy Stanton raised, and quite rightly so. I didn't mention racism. It was perhaps an omission in it, but again, it goes to the whole cultural issue that is there within the organisation, and which we're determined. And part of addressing that is a multicultural and diverse personnel in service. We do have several countries represented, including Ukrainians, Polish, and wide other, to name but a few, that participate in the Defence Forces today, and we'll continue to try and make sure we're an open and inclusive employer in terms of the opportunities presented, and we maintain that and hope to continue to maintain that and to grow it also in our participation of it. On the number of ships that can go to sea right now, I think it's well publicised that we have 4 ships that currently, with two on operational pause currently, and of those ships we maintain a rotational patrol duty and MDSA, which is security patrols as required. And we maintain a very active operational stance with those crews. The plans to retain our people. We have, as I said, we have engaged with a very mature recruitment strategy right now, and we're also at the final stages of maturing our retention strategy in this space. But specifically to the Naval Service, what might be of interest to the committee members is that we're at the final stages of employing a marine-specific contractor to help us employ specialists into the Naval Service. That is a recruitment head contractor that would have specific expertise in the maritime and marine environment. In other words, we'll be able to tap into, hopefully, the specialist areas such as our ERAs, electrical radar artificers, in the organisation. And we hope to grow the participation through that. We also, of course, have a seagoing service commitment scheme in place to try and retain people with specialist skills. That will form part of the overarching, I suppose, complexity of the allowances that are there at the moment, to try and capture them all under one allowance, a patrol duty allowance. So we're very actively engaged in trying to create innovative approaches to, firstly, recruiting by either recruitment but direct entry at the required skill sets where we have considerable deficits, which is causing our operational kind of capabilities to be depleted at this point in time as a consequence of our personnel issue. When I spoke about the personnel versus the platforms, this is what I was talking about. Just specifically on the psychometric testing, because I know that this becomes an area of interest to a lot of people, and we're living in a very modern society, and human resource recruitment has taken a lot of different turns and twists over the years, and in the last 2 decades in particular. Just on the numbers that you alluded to, it is 50% of people don't even attempt the psychometric test when it is forwarded to them, or 50% of them don't complete it, and 40% of those would be in the 0 to 10 percentile completion, which means they haven't even started it. That's just the way the numbers break down. So it's not a direct consequence of the psychometric test in that circumstance. It's just people apply, they get a psychometric test, and they don't follow anything past that. But we do recognise across a number of different areas where there are barriers, if you like, to people entry. We also have a medical requirement. We also have a training and fitness requirement. It's not just solely centred on the psychometric test. And we're constantly reviewing and trying to, if you like, create the conditions to maximise people's potential of succeeding, because we don't want to turn anybody away. But we do have to maintain that level of standard. And to that end, we've created the conditions now where we try and amalgamate all of those together in one particular day. We support people through IT services and through our people to show them and help them through the psychometric test, through practices and so on and so forth. We've created a RAG system which we're about to sign off on around the fitness test, a red, amber and green, in order that those are green, pass obviously, go straight through. Those that are amber, that we consider that are nearly there, that we can encourage and help and support to get over the line, and that they'll achieve that in a certain time frame. And of course, there are those that will simply not make it, which is part of our processes. So we are constantly reviewing it. We have a number of steps and measures around the change and changing our orientation in all of these regards. And the psychometric test is one that we're very conscious of, and we're very much delivering on under those terms. Just on the commemorations, and that was raised by Senator Crockwell. As I said in my opening remarks, I'm very proud of the very conscious efforts, in particular over the last 12 months, that Oireachtas na hÉireann has been involved with in a very, I suppose, sensitive period during the 10 years of decade of commemorations. And I'm very conscious of our role and how we were to be very much an inclusive and mature organisation when it came to that. We do have plans around the commemoration of the national monument in Glasnevin. We have a date set for that. We have plans in place, and we'd already received approval. So for others to go ahead and do that, I perfectly respect that, but we have our own institutional planning around that, which was already in place from the planning group which I established over 14 months ago to look at the totality of the year 2022. And that process has been ongoing, and a date has been set which is coincidental with the transposition into legislation in 1923 of the standing up of the Defence Forces Oireachtas na hÉireann as an institution into the Act at that period of time. And that was always in the plan, and that was the plan on which we do it. And as an institution, that will be our national commemoration of that site and those that died from the National Army during that period. And that is the manner in which we do it. Of course, others are entitled to and are free to celebrate that, or to commemorate that, should I say, in any way they see fit. But of course, as an institution, we have to observe and to honour and respect our own planning around that space, if you will. And so there was no disrespect. It was just purely a simple piece of our approach on it. With regards to the acts of valour, I know and respect very much your views around medals and all of this area, which is a sensitive, emotive, if you like, and very important and special to an awful lot of people. But as I suppose, as an institution, we have very deliberate processes around how we deliver in terms of medals boards and how they are, and to go back over them again or otherwise would have to be a very considered piece. I'm not closing the door on it, shall I put it that way, but it's not something I had been overly familiar with before you have raised it in front of me here today, so I would need some time to consider that. But I would caveat it by saying that we have very deliberative processes around medals, Any medals that have been awarded to some of the names you have mentioned, which are familiar, were done on a deliberative process to go back and revise or to revision of those processes. Would have to be taken with under serious consideration if it was to be undertaken, because to any action there is an equal and opposite reaction quite often, and we'd have to take all of those pieces in. But I do respect your views, as I always do, Senator.
You might just bear in mind, Black Hawk Down, they weren't afraid to go back and look at that and upgrade all of the people that were involved in that. Other countries have done it and have not been afraid of it. Leave aside the Jadaville issue, that's a separate issue. But the other issues, particularly among veterans, it's the number of veterans that approach me and tell me about wonderful things that happened. I wasn't there, I don't know. But I do think a look back would be a good thing to do.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time, and
sorry
to avoid opening up issues again, because a huge range of questions were proffered to the Chief of Staff, who hasn't yet completed his response.
That's fine, Chair.
You raised as supplementary the vacancies in the NCO's rank and whether that contributed to some of the issues that raised. The vacancies of the NCO's rank, if you like, are relatively new. And even though they're there with a while, they're relatively new in terms of the timeframes which I've captured with Senator Cloonan. And I don't think it is influential in terms of the maintenance of discipline and good order that has been broken down so badly, if you like, in a sense, during the timeframes and the period of time that's referred to. So I don't think there's a direct association that we can bring in that space. That's just my initial reflection on it. And on the veterans associations, as you know, we have we have recognised veterans associations. We have fully recognised veterans associations, which I think represent the IONVA, the ONE, and of course ARCO, which do an exceptional job in terms of representation at the appropriate level for the organisation as a whole, and I'm quite satisfied in that space. There is, on the revision of requirements of subsurface, there is no revision. The equipment development plan and the ongoing considerations of all our capabilities are and I'm not aware of any revision of our subsurface capabilities or requirements other than those that we're already aware of and the gapping that we have around that space in particular. The issue on pension discussions. Again, pensions are something that have been decided upon by policy and by government, and it's not for me to make a judgment and I'll give an opinion on it, and I'd refrain to do so. The mandatory retirement ages that you refer to is something that's that is of course under consideration. When we look across the broader uniformed services of the state, when we look at Garda Síochána, the mandatory retirement age is 60. That's a fact. When we look at the prison service, despite having maybe 38, I think, or even larger number of grades within the prison service, the mandatory retirement age is 60. When we look at the prison service and the number of grades they have, the mandatory retirement age is 55. When we look at the defence forces, we have across all grades, we have differing mandatory retirement ages. And this was, as Deputy Berry has alluded to, in the 90s, this was put in place at a bespoke level for reasons 30 years ago, for reasons perhaps around bringing down the age profile of the organisation, creating a fitter and more modern defence forces at that point in time. And therefore, these are the facts that surround the mandatory retirement ages, and I recognise the challenges that they're causing internally within the organisation as a barrier to retention at this point in time. The ARW allowances is under arbitration at this point, so I think that says enough in terms of it's arbitratable, and it is being arbitrated on it. I've spoken about the EU battle group and the cultural issues. Just if I can say on the broader cultural issues, and I know there was a lot that the Senator raised on these issues, I think I've said with regards to my acknowledgement of them and the fact that But I also want to give you a degree of comfort around it, if it is comfort, because we can't give comfort in this area. I'm very conscious of language is very important, as you rightly said, and I'm very, very conscious of that. But we haven't, we have taken lessons from other militaries. We have brought in the likes of the Rape Crisis Centre to help us understand, to give us confidence, to brief us, and to help us with our understanding around equality and around the issues that are involved in that. So I just wanted to put that on the record to this committee as well. And we haven't stood still either in our timeline in the last, since I've taken over office. We have created the conditions where we have stepped out and did immediate response teams at that time. We did extend our Inspire, which is a helpline service, to the wider Defence Forces, their families, and to the veterans as well, to create the helpline for people. We also set up with the Department of Defence and the Minister at the time a confidential contact person. But I also stood up an organisation standing committee, which was a diverse committee in terms of gender, in terms of rank, headed up by my Assistant Chief of Staff here, to bring about changes that were immediate in terms of response. An example about that in terms of our culture and internally at the moment is when we look to other organisations and we looked to the whole question about sexual ethics and responsible relationships and the training required around that. There was a gap and a deficit that was badly needed in our organisation. We've piloted that, and we recognised that we needed external instruction and external support to deliver that internally in the organisation, which we have gone to tender on, and we hope to stand that up with 5 instructors from external sources to deliver it to the organisation as a whole. So these are just a sample, a flavour, if you like, of some of the changes, if you like, around the cultural space and the actions that we've taken. And as I said, like you, I am waiting for the IRG report to come. I'll ask you honestly, it will be stark, I have no doubt about that. I'm under no illusions, as you are not. I have my eyes wide open, as do the General Staff. And I'm now under no illusions, and I've never shirked from my views in this space, and I've been very open about it. And when it comes, I will engage with all stakeholders, and I've given that commitment to the Taoiseach in writing, and to the Minister and Minister of Defence, that I will engage with all stakeholders with regards to recommendations that he accepts from that report, and we will get on with it and get forceful about implementation, and I can assure you of that also. And from that I think you can take that there won't be any pushback in terms of my position in terms of transformation of our culture. And I'm very, I won't say optimistic is the wrong word, but I'm very engaged to ensure that we achieve transformation in this space. And I think we have already made some progress, and we see some grass shoots in that space. And in terms of complaints received, which I see as a positive, in terms of bystanders taking action, and so on and so forth. There are clear examples of that in terms of people moving through the liaison process from an internal disciplinary process to an external Garda Síochána reporting process. We've seen many examples of that in the organisation, and I welcome all of that because it shows signs of a maturity happening within the organisation in terms of acceptance, and I can only change that. Just Deputy Clerk, on the IPs, as you know, that falls the responsibility for IPs falls under the Department of Children primarily. As a government agent, as a Defence Force, we're asked by other departments to support. We have provided support by putting tentage, etc., into Collins Barracks and the relevant engineering supports. We have no other role in it other than that. And the fact that it's a former army barracks is just part of it. The role around the Department of Children, their responsibilities and standing up, and the responsibility for operating.
Was whether the decision to use Collins Barracks was made by the Defence Forces or the Department of Defence.
I beg your pardon. I can't honestly answer that question.
Fine. I appreciate it. I understand.
I don't have an answer that I can give you. We are just asked and tasked with providing in that space, and we have done that. And of course,
I appreciate your honesty.
That's it. Thank you. And you asked a question about the pace adequate to address, and this is something we challenge ourselves all of the time with. But I'm very conscious that we have to, and I've been very clear in my internal messaging, we have to build the foundations and create the enablers that are important to ensure success. I'm very also conscious that when you go through any transformation process, you have to demonstrably show early wins. And that's why those low-hanging fruit, if you like, were important to get across the line at the outset. Why these new appointments, why the creation of new entities such as the Office of Reserve Affairs and the offices of, but at the same time the governance structures the financial undertaking in terms of the year-on-year increase in the resources, that they're all guaranteed, and that those processes take time. And I think by any measure, the manner in which the Memo for Government succeeded through government by July, 6 months after the Commission report, I think is a measure of a success in terms of the timeline. And the implementation plan and engaging with an external consultant in that area is important to make sure we get it right in terms of implementation, that we can deliver in a timeline commensurate with the resources that we have to deliver it. So I think whether the pace is fast enough or not is subjective, is what I'm saying. And from my perspective, I'm giving our briefing to the high-level steering board and to the implementation group body specifically tasked with making sure that and determined that it is delivered is important.
Sorry, Chair. I asked the Chief a very specific question about an apology to myself and my family for the reprisal that was visited upon us. I mean, all I did was engage in leadership, in holding the organisation to account as instructed by the Chief of Staff. And, you know, this committee and these houses are all about holding powerful institutions of the state to account. And quite a number of my questions weren't answered, but that's one that I would like you to address in the time that we have left.
I'm really not sure, Senator, with respect, if the matter that you have raised and that you have been personally and professionally engaged in for many years can be addressed by the Chief of Staff.
Well, it's on the public. It's been on the
a simple yes or no answer.
It's been on the public record. It's been on the public record for over 20 years.
Yeah, well,
and the Chief of Staff is well aware of it, as are all of the individuals in the room here.
We've given the Chief of Staff an opportunity to reply to a number of questions, perhaps in a way that hasn't been optimal in terms of the grouping of questions.
Well, I think an apology would be the opportunity to show the leadership that indicates that there is a cultural change. Without that, you know, it sends a very clear signal that these matters have not changed and that there is still...
Well, I don't think that's a fair appraisal of issues as having been addressed by the Chief of Staff.
Well, with respect, Chair, this is my lived experience.
Or indeed over the past 2.5 hours this afternoon.
I think it's a missed opportunity.
Right.
Sorry, Chief, if I was going to mention there, the high-level action plan, the fact that it only accepted 37% of the recommendations that came from the Commission report, does that influence the ability of the Defence Forces to be easier able to meet those easy wins? If that figure had been higher, would it have placed additional barriers in front of you getting those easier wins? Would have made your job a little bit difficult? Was the fact that they accepted so little of them in the high-level action plan a positive step to do?
There were 38 actions that were in the high-level action plan, which I think was a fair share, if you like, a reasonable share of the actual totality of 130 recommendations in the time frame in which we tried to deliver those actions. And they were identified as, in the sense of those that could be delivered in a shorter time frame in order to create momentum around but also around the critical enablers that were required. But it's also important, Deputy, to remember that there were no resources allocated for the implementation of the high-level action plan in 2022, that was to commence in 2023. So all of these things influenced it. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that there is an action plan update in terms of high-level action plan update being prepared for the Taoiseach, which will be published very, very shortly, I would assume, before the actual implementation.
Again, that only refers to those 38, 37%. I know the figures are very close, but it's 37% and 38 actions, yeah.
Yeah, no, it does, yeah. But I think that's a reasonable achievement in the 6-month period under which they were flagged from July. We started in September. And of course, the report and the update that would be very positive in terms of the achievement of those actions at this point in time. Senator Cloonan, I think, in fairness to your question and that, I haven't been familiar with your request that you have directly put at this point in time. I would be more than happy to consider that and to discuss it with you, even. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to respond immediately because it would be reactive. And for that purpose, I would I would be more than willing to meet you and to discuss with you what it is exactly you're asking me to apologise for, and to detail it out at that point in time, if that is satisfactory for you at this stage.
Well, I appreciate that very much, and I await your invitation. But it is on the public record and has been for some time. But I do appreciate your absolute bona fides in that regard.
In the last 18 months, I wouldn't have been familiar with that.
Yeah, and I'd be delighted to meet you any time. And in relation to all these issues, you know, I have never once been approached in the last 23 years by anybody in the organisation, despite the fact that I'm the person who set out in great detail the causes, the patterns of this violence, and the outcomes and the solutions. All you have to do is talk to me. And that's why I do take great comfort in your words, because Jackie McCrum is the first person in the Department of Defence to speak to me in 23 years. And you're the first Chief of Staff, with the exception of Admiral Mellett, who's indicated that you would be happy to speak to me. So I would consider that a hugely positive development. But I do think it is a watershed moment for the organisation, and I only want to be constructive and helpful. But I have a family. We have endured a great deal of reprisal that is highly targeted, and I've no doubt that when we have that conversation, we should have a productive exchange. But I do thank you for your words, and I await your invitation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. We have an offer of a meeting which has been made by the Chief of Staff. It has been accepted by Senator Clonan. It will be outside the arena of this committee, and we wish you well in that regard.
Thank you, Chairman. Just if I can, I'm conscious that Deputy Wilson hasn't had any of my responses yet, so if I could address maybe some of your issues, and maybe if I've missed some points as I've gone along through my notes, as we can come back to it. You quite rightly said that the systematic closure of barracks was a policy decision that was made around the time of the late 90s, through the 80s, and right through up to the reorganisation in 2012, in fact. I'm very conscious of the very fine barracks that exists in Cavan. I've flown the helicopter into that helipad on many occasions, so I'm very familiar with it. I'm also very familiar it's occupied and utilised by another department at this point in time also, which has to be borne in mind of it. But speaking more widely to I think the fundamental strategic piece, if you like, that you spoke to about recruitment potential and the demographic and the geographical distribution of that. Of course, when you don't have a footprint in a particular geographical area, it does cause a downturn, if you like, on the potential. But I have to say that that in the organisation that we have today, and in the levels of communications, the manner in which we can deliver messaging across various media, we are very proactive in terms of trying to be very inclusive of where we do bring people from. We have a lot of Cavan people, for instance, that are barracked in Athlone, I know that, and a lot of people in the 28th Battalion from that area as well. And in Dundalk, and so you'll be very familiar that those that are truly, and what we are very engaged in is trying to attract people that want to serve and want to join the Defence Forces, and but the re-engagement of Cavan Barracks is really a policy issue. It comes to the structural reorganisation, redesign of the Defence Forces, where it may well come into view or into the lens of consideration again, if I can put it that way. But that is yet to be determined in terms of our restructuring and our redesign of the organisation. So with regards to your question on the future, then of course I would, that all of the potential options will be on the table in terms of our restructuring. But I cannot say, as will many other areas in that. But it does. I will take your view into on board from that point of view. I think I answered your question, Chairman, about the competitive edge piece around in my response earlier on. But
I am very conscious, General Clancy, of the significant number of questions, and I would say to yourself and your team, if there are any issues upon which you would like to expand or even develop further in response to members, we'd be happy to hear from you in writing. I see some hands going up. We are bound to compete.
Question around protected disclosure, the Ombudsman and the Air Corps and the Supreme Court ruling.
From Deputy Clark,
the General
Deputy Brady
comes back in.
Briefly.
Just to go back to the Working Time Directive, because in your contribution you said the majority of activities fall within the scope of the Working Time Directive. And to follow up on the point that Senator Crockwell made as to whether you or your staff have asked for any areas to be exempted from the Working Time Directive, and whether you see, operations such as bomb disposal, naval patrols, or aid to civil power as being covered within the Working Time Directive. What exemptions have you asked for, if indeed you have asked for any, and whether you see, operations such as those as being covered within the Working Time Directive? Just one point there, you mentioned the figure currently within the Defence Forces of being 7,917 currently, and that's down 481 in 13 months. So when the Commission report was published last February, nearly 500 members of the Defence Forces have left. So whether you see that as members of the Defence Forces voting no confidence in the ability to implement the findings of the Commission report and voting with their feet, and in doing so the institutional memory loss to the organisation is immense. So when do you think there will be a reversal to stop the hemorrhaging of numbers, in which we're seeing over the last month another 1%, over 100 members of the Defence Force have left, even though this Commission report is there with all of the recommendations how to fix the chronic problems within the Defence Forces? So when are we going to see a reversal of the hemorrhaging?
And final supplementary. Final supplementary.
Very, very brief. So, Chair, I do take the Chief's point that the permanent Defence Force, our regular troops, are competing with the private sector when it comes to recruitment and retention, and that's entirely as it is across the world. But our Reserve Defence Force isn't, and we still are maybe 60% below strength. You can have a job in the private sector and be a member of the Reserve Defence Force. Now, we had an excellent meeting about 2 weeks ago here with the Civil Defence. It's very easy to get into the civil defence. It's easy to stay in the civil defence, but for whatever reason, it's almost impossible to get into the Reserve Defence Force. So we know that a lot of people who leave the Permanent Defence Force get in touch with us saying, we would love to be in the Reserve Defence Force. We've retired at the age of 30, we're fit, we're healthy. Where is the blockage? Because from a legislative point of view, you can transfer in from the permanent to the Reserve Defence Force. From a regulatory point of view, it's possible. We've heard of a trickle of people who are allowed transfer from the permanent to the Reserve Defence Force. Where is the blockage, and can it be removed, would be the key question. And then from a recruitment into the Reserve Defence Force, I said it's easy to get into the Civil Defence Force. The Civil Defence, there's no medical, there's no fitness test. When I joined the Reserve Defence Force, it was easy to do so. Have we invented these barriers that are unnecessary? And then when we invent the barriers, we don't have enough medical officers to implement these rules we're bringing in. And I take the Chief's point that we're outsourcing induction medicals, but to me, we should be insourcing induction medicals because they're so important, and we need more medical officers. And just the last point in the Reserve Defence Force, and it was a success, I think, of this committee, that Reserve Defence Force personnel are now allowed travel overseas on operations. Has that happened yet, General? And if it hasn't, when are we likely to see the first member of the Reserve Defence Force deployed overseas? I know they travel overseas for training to Oireachtas and to the UK, and that's exactly as it should be. But have they been deployed operationally? And if not, when are we likely to see that happening? Thanks very much for your indulgence, Chief. Thanks.
Deputy Stanton, on a related issue.
I was only in once, so far our colleagues have been a few times. Just a few issues. First of all, I did ask how long it takes from date of application to date of attestation for recruit and various areas. It seems to be quite, it's related to what Deputy Berry has been saying as well with respect to the various barriers. People kind of get tired waiting and head off somewhere else. On the issue with respect to the psychometric tests, I asked a parliamentary question, and the answer was replied to me a few weeks later through the military by the Minister from the military authorities. And what it said was, in 2021, tests administered 4,108, completed tests failed, 2,178. That came from yourselves. So that doesn't imply that someone started and kind of couldn't carry on. And even if it's a case that someone did start the psychometric test and didn't finish it, we've put questions around that as well. Because we could be losing a lot of people who would actually be inducted into the Defence Forces because of this barrier, as Deputy Berry has been alluding to. And I've met people who talk about this, and it seems insignificant, but I don't think it is. Yeah, thank you.
Address those? I'll address them. Okay. In fairness, thank you all for your questions. I think I've answered a lot of this. It's kind of nearly seeing it's questions, but I'll refer back to it, in particular my opening statement around the Reserve Defence Forces. If I can start, Deputy Berry, with yourself. There is no question, but I wouldn't like to. I'm not comparing the Reserve Defence Force with civil defence. Firstly, I can't do that. I can't accept that comparison, if you like. The single force concept is based around the fact that everyone is the same. That is, the Reserve Defence Forces and the Permanent Defence Forces, in order to serve together, integrate together, they must be of a similar standard. And I think we both accept that concept to work. It has to be on that basis, and therefore the bar, if you like, in terms of entry has to be similar in that space. There is, as you rightly pointed out, there is no regulatory barrier to transferring into the first line reserve, for instance. Okay, it is something that I suppose the corporate memory has been lost on to a degree, but these are issues that I've tasked the Office of Reserve Affairs. As I said, I've put a colonel in charge of that, specifically to drive and to put, if you like, the hand on the tiller on these issues, which was absent, as I said, since 2012, since the reorganisation, and we've in effect had nobody focused primarily on the Reserve Affairs. So I'm aware of all of those issues that you've raised, and it is purposefully the Reserve Affairs Office will be, through the regeneration, addressing those insofar as we can. And the numbers, as you rightly say, are down, but the ideal would be to have the medical internal, but that's not the reality of what we have today, and we need to accelerate our ability to induct quicker through medicals and so on and so forth. The average time frame is 5 months, Deputy Stanton, from start to finish as it stands, but I want to improve that and to enhance it, and that's why we're looking at the 3 areas specifically in terms of it. I accept your point, but getting down into the data and stratifying down into the data about failures and non-failures and so on and so forth, you were given holistic figures, if you like, as per the question that was posed at that time. So that's a little bit more elucidated in that space. Pardon?
I just wanted to clarify that because
these are always evolving, those numbers anyway. But I do accept your point that we have potential that we need to capitalise on, and I certainly want to capitalise on it, as does the Taoiseach. I'm assured of that, and he is exercising us to the fullest degree in this area, and we meet him once a month now specifically on recruitment and retention as a sole agenda item, and so he's very exercised in this space, as he should be, and as I said, the leadership he has shown has been first class since he has taken over. So I looked at I recall, Deputy Brady, your question was based around
the exemptions from
the working time directive. I beg your pardon. Yeah, that's right. Sorry,
operations that can be rostered for.
Just finally, again on that, as I said at the beginning, we've a collaborative approach ongoing. I don't think it'd be appropriate at this point in time to jeopardise the discussions and the consultations with our stakeholders, but there are areas within scope, and there are areas that are not within scope. And as I said, the Slovenian judgment has been very definitive, if you like, in one sense, instructive, and those discussions are maturing, not only with the civil and military part of the stakeholder engagement, but also in the consultative space with the representative associations. And I said there'll be further meetings later on this week with that. So I don't intend to going into what is or isn't within scope, as I put it, not necessarily exemptions. Scope is what we're talking about here. But ultimately, This is a matter for the Taoiseach to decide and Minister for Defence to make a decision on. And as I said, when that is done and the heads of bill are finalised and that decision is made, that will come before the Houses of the Oireachtas to finalise in the transposition into legislation at that point in time. So I think that's as full an answer as I feel that it would be appropriate for me to give at this point in time with respect. Okay.
The second point, sorry, Chair, was just around the continuous hemorrhaging of members of the force. 481 have left since the publication of the report. Whether you're concerned that hasn't acted as a catalyst to instill confidence within the force, and whether you would be concerned with that, that members are still voting with their feet, leaving the force in large numbers, and when realistically do you think there is going to be a reversal?
I think at the very outset of my opening statement, I recognise fully the challenges, and this was a specific challenge that I alluded to within my commentary. And I accept the challenge that we face in that, and we're working very, very hard to try and redress that with our colleagues in the Department of Defence, to give us that edge, to redress it. I cannot say with any clarity or certainty when we'd hope to change that around, but it's certainly we have to bring down the overall number of 10.72% in terms of turnover. Any healthy organisation, military organisation, would accept a 5 to 6%, maybe 7% turnover rate would be something. And when we reach that target, I would suggest we will have moved into a positive growth rate. Part of that is our recruitment strategy, which is development about taking more recruits in on an annual basis, but also increasing the impact of our retention initiatives to decrease that. The number, as you've said, alluded to, we've had a 25% increase or so, I think, on those leaving the organisation on a voluntary basis in the last 12 months. We had, as I mentioned, perhaps a quieter period during COVID, and it's yet to be determined whether this is an accelerated process or whether it's just a consequence of delayed post-COVID. And really, it's too early to make that determinative analysis at this point in time. But we are very conscious of it, and we will be monitoring that to come to a determination.
My understanding, Chief, is that there's about 200.
I'm not going to open it up again, Senator Cox.
Sorry, no, that's fine. I just wanted to.
Councillor, the Deputy Clerk.
And I am conscious, Chief, that we are approaching to our 3-hour time frame in here. I don't think it is. Let me refresh the memory. Your response to the Air Corps failing to comply with the Supreme Court order.
Yeah.
The other question that I posed to you regarding the WRC ruling in the Yvonne O'Rourke case around the training, and what changes, if any, has the amendments to the Protected Disclosure Act in 2022 had on who is responsible for managing protected disclosures, the Defence Forces or the Department?
Okay, final word to the Chief of Staff on that.
If I could start with the Supreme Court ruling, if I can revert to you on that, if that is okay, Deputy. I mean, the Chairman offered me the opportunity of reverting on that. Yeah. I'm conscious of that a huge amount of effort and time went into replying and complying with that, and whether the outcome of that wasn't satisfactory to the Supreme Court, and I know that it certainly is not the intention not to comply. So therefore, I believe there's some time and scope given to fulfil that requirement. But I would prefer to come back with a formal response on that space. The other matters were the Protected Disclosure Act. The protected disclosure depends on where it comes into, of course. Primarily it comes in as responsibility of the Taoiseach, and it comes in on the civil side, primarily the protected disclosures. But under the Act, as you'll be aware, whoever it comes into has a duty and responsibility not to reveal it, but to act on it and to establish it until such time as that it can either discount it as a protected disclosure or keep it as it. And that's the way we act. We have a Protected Disclosures Office for anything that comes into the Defence Forces under the Defence and it's declared. And whether it's declared as one or not, but needs to be treated as initially until it's determined one way or the other, that's the approach that's taken. Likewise, there is also one under the Department of Defence, the Protected Disclosures Office, and they take care of it when it comes in. And obviously, if it comes, and that's the way they're treated internally, and they're treated under the legislation and how it. We also have, of course, our under our A7 administration, our complaints procedure, which covers the grievances under Chapter 1, and which grievances under Chapter 2, which cover the extent from the bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, and so on under Chapter 1, to grievances and complaints under Chapter 2. Each of those they're interactive between both if necessary, and of course ultimately the ultimate end part of that is through the Ombudsman's office, which you refer to under that complaints procedure. And the final part of your questions were around
the WRC ruling.
Sorry, what was your specific question on that?
The WRC ruling in relation to Yvonne O'Rourke, where it was determined that discrimination had taken place. There was very specific recommendations made by the WRC in terms of review and of training. Has that work started? Has it been completed?
Yes, it has indeed, yeah. And that was, I think, in 2020, if my memory serves me, at the end of 2020. And there was a group that worked for the following year and developed the response to the WRC on that. I'm just recalling this now. We put in place the training specifically that was identified in that, and that is now embedded in our training pre any interview boards and so on that are required. In fact, I think the ACOS would have attended an interview training course where that would have been embedded in a full day course. So that has started and has been implemented, and the full report is ongoing in terms of trying to develop out the responses to the working time, or to the WRC from that.
When you say a report has been developed, who does the report go to?
No, our own working group internally to respond and how we respond to it, and developing the training initiatives and so on and so forth, and what we're required to do from the working group that sat for the year to implement what the WRC ruling was at that time. And that incorporate our policies, our procedures, all on equality, etc., performance management, promotions, and the interviews. So the entire spectrum was that, and we're working through that as I said.
Okay.
But we're determined to implement it as you said. But that is in
We'll check back in at a later date.
Apologies for
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as I said to the Chief of Staff and his team, if there are any issues that perhaps on reflection might require a more expansive answer, we would be very happy to hear in writing in response to members' queries. So on behalf of the Joint Committee, I wish to thank Lieutenant General Sean Clancy and his team for meeting with us this afternoon for what was a comprehensive and most informative opening statement, and furthermore for dealing with the queries and questions of members in the manner in which you have. On behalf of the committee, we want to acknowledge the importance of your leadership at a time of change, at a time of challenge, and we very much acknowledge and appreciate the duty of service to the state by members of Oireachtas and the men and women of our defence forces. And we wish you ongoing success and indeed goodwill in the challenge of the reform programme. And in that regard, you have the support of the Dáil and Seanad. You have the support of the members of this committee, and I have no doubt that this engagement this afternoon, I think, will warrant a further session between now and the end of the year. So thank you for being with us. Thank you.